Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And this week, we're going to be talking about two brand new, well, I guess three, technically, new albums from artists. We're going to be talking exclusively about artists that we've actually covered on the show before. We're rounding out the year the way we started it by talking about Richard Dawson, his latest project, his album The Ruby Chord, big ass record. And we're also going to be talking about the final two projects from Brockhampton, the family and trademark. We're also going to be talking about this week's record club is going to be on Michael Jackson's Thriller. So this is one of those record clubs you're going to want to stick around for, because we're covering a canonical classic in the world of popular music. I think the last time we covered an album this big was probably when we did fucking Wish You Were Here or something, but big stuff on the way. And we also, this week on the Past Record Club, covered for its 30th anniversary, The Cure's album Wish, my favorite Cure album, and an album that Ryley also loves a fair bit as well. It's a good discussion. Go watch that if you haven't watched that already, and go stream the 30th anniversary remastered thingy so you can wallow in sadness. It's the holidays, bitch.
Yes, so lots of great conversations been going up on the channel lately, and lots more to come as well. But before we get into our main reviews today, let's talk about what we have been listening to for the last 7 days. Jake, what have you been listening to?
Honestly, not a whole lot of interesting things, because reserving my limited free time for the remainder of the year to sort of finalize all of our end of the year lists. So everybody stay vigilant, because we're going to come at you with some good end of the year lists. It's going to be fun. A lot of good stuff and a whole lot of bad stuff to talk about. And I'm just revising my opinions on all of them. In terms of what I've actually been listening to, in terms of things that might make for a nice mention, there was a rumor that was going around that Danny Brown might have dropped something on Friday because of an Instagram post he made, and then he didn't, which was like fucking low, man. But to get in the spirit of things, I decided to re-listen to a little bit of one Mr. Daniel Sewell's projects, in that, because I'm a huge Danny Brown fan. We've never really gotten the chance to like properly talk about him, just because his last proper album release was before the podcast started, and he doesn't release things like super duper frequently. But I am a really big fan. I love Triple X. I think Old is really underrated. And of course, his immortal classic that I think will be remembered as a decade-defining moment for hip-hop being Atrocity Exhibition, an album I've loved for a very long time, but has like slowly grown on me for being an album I just kind of recognized as being great, to an album where now I'm just like, oh my God. I took we're recording this on Black Friday, so I took it upon myself to buy as many Blu-rays and vinyl possible that I could find that are on my wish list that are marked down, and Atrocity Exhibition was like the first thing I bought, just because, again, this is a record that, at least with me anyway, it is such a bug shit crazy album that it just kind of takes a while to properly grow on you. There are always songs, like I remember I was absolutely obsessed with the song Rolling Stone ever since I heard it. The hook from Petite Noir on that song is so fucking fantastic. I've literally like had days where I just walk around my house just being like, no, I'm living like a rolling stone, don't feel for me. I love that song. And Danny's verse is great on it too, but it's just some of the best abstract hip-hop ever made, sequenced one after another. The run of Tell Me What I Don't Know through Gold Dust on this album is fucking certifiably insane. Black Milk, man, I need to look into this producer's work more, because his work here is like, I know that this album is like a super revered classic at this point, but like, I genuinely think this might be the best produced hip-hop album of the 2010s. I can't really think of anything that comes to mind where I would just be like, no, yeah, that's definitely better. Like, it's like, I don't know, like, you know, To Pimp a Butterfly's definitely up there and shit, but like, I don't know, nothing is this raw in terms of how bold it is. You have shit like, again, beat on something like Gold Dust and Ain't It Funny, which just has the most bass heavy rhythmic production I've heard in like this side of death metal. I mean, it's nuts. Gold Dust actually feels like it is like someone is trying to leap through your headphones and like beat the shit out of your brain, and I love that for it. The horns on that song are so fucking big. I love how like Danny's one of those artists who I think really finds a kind of beauty in a sense of one dimensionality. This album, it's called Atrocity Exhibition. You know, it has a song called Downward Spiral. I feel like Danny's a really musically literate guy, which is why he's worked in samples from stuff like, you know, the Joy Division song Atrocity Exhibition, for example. But it's very much in the vein of albums like that, and this is an album that's just a complete mental spiral. It's just a journey from front to back of nothing but like depravity and stuff, and you'd think that would wear old, but the way he sort of fleshes it out and adds a kind of body to the thematic core of it in songs like fucking Downward Spiral or Hell for It, or even stuff like Today. Like there's so many like nuggets of genuine human pathos in there that really, really work in the album's favor and really serve to create this like grander portrait that feels really human, despite the entire album feeling like it came from another fucking planet. So, I mean, nobody needed me to remind them how good that album is, but rest assured, it still absolutely is. And even songs that I wasn't hugely into, like Get High, I love now. Like, that song is just so weird. It's got those weird pitched up chipmunk vocals in the background, and Danny's like, if you had a bad day and want the stress to go away, you get high. It's so fucking weird. But again, it manages to work. And I think what's even funnier about that is the fact that he goes so all out, and then 3 years later, he follows it up with You Know What I'm Saying, which, again, this is a project most people generally like, but I would almost go so far as to say that this is a particularly underrated album. And it's pretty easy to see why that's the case, though, is because this is him at his most straight-laced, his most together. It feels like the albums that people really know and remember him for, like Triple X and Atrocity Exhibition, are so focused on him spiraling out of control and just sort of like emphasizing the cartoonishness of his delivery, that once he like reels it in and shows a tighter control over his flows, over the production, over like everything, it feels like that might be almost like, you know, detract from the appeal of Danny. But I think he's a more versatile artist than people get it credit for. I really like You Know What I'm Saying. It feels like a long extended stand-up act from a really funny comedian, but it also has some pretty sick beats. There's, I mean, fucking Three Tears has the feature from Run the Jewels on here, which is fantastic. Negro Spiritual has JPEG Mafia on it. Blood Orange's feature on Shine is beautiful. Like, this is a tight 34-minute long record, and I don't really think it's got any misses. It doesn't hit the highs of Atrocity Exhibition or even Triple X. I would still say that's probably a better album. But I still think that it is something that maybe deserves a bit of revision, much like Old, for that matter, which is also an album that's very rooted separately in a different kind of appeal than Danny's other stuff. But I like how aesthetically boundary pushing it is. It's not quite like Downward Spiral. Atrocity Exhibition is something that like it feels completely like its own beast, whereas on Old he's like taking like club and trap aesthetics and like dance music aesthetics and just pushing them in an almost like hyper pop-esque way. And it's really compelling. It's really fun, even though that album definitely has its fair share of problems. But I'm hoping that this next record comes out relatively soon. We need more food. Father, please feed us. It's supposed to be called Quaranta, which makes me immediately be like, okay, is this a Danny Brown album about quarantine? Do we need to brace for some topical bars? But I have faith in him that he'll be able to deliver a project that's satisfying no matter what thematic angle he goes at it from. So who knows?
Well, he was originally working on Quadruple X. Like, he was originally going to do essentially a sequel album to Triple X, and I think that's kind of evolved. into what
Mm-hmm.
Quaranta is. But yeah, really looking forward to
Okay.
that. And I just want to say that I feel like I haven't talked about him as much on this show for whatever reason, but Danny is actually my favorite hip hop artist of the 2010s. I think that he
Yeah.
is
No,
I mean he's
he's up
just my
there.
favorite. He's just I think has the best uh run of albums. I think that Triple X, Old, Across the Exhibition, and You Know What I'm Saying are all like at minimum sensationally great records, and I love all
Yeah.
of them in very distinct ways. Um, yeah, I probably will, um, agree with the consensus that Atrocity Exhibition is the best one, but I also kind of feel a little bit as though it kind of overshadows, and I like, which is what you were saying, I know, overshadows records like You Know What I'm Saying and Old, and which I'm especially fond of Old. We were having a conversation about this week because that album came out in 2013, and 2013 was just a year where I was like really like clicking into the groove of like current
Mm-hmm.
music and stuff. And so I was there when that came out, and that album was like it's one of a handful of albums from that year that really like left this fundamental impression on me, and I think really shaped the direction of my tastes in a lot of different ways. And
I can see that.
and yeah, and for Danny, like one of the things I love so much about all four records that Danny put out in that decade is, I mean, not counting the hybrid, I guess, which is also very good,
Mm-hmm.
for what it's worth, but the
Yes.
four main records that he put out, they're all so distinct from one another, and they all have completely uh, self-contained but also interrelated conceptual ideas and thematic interests that all feed into who Danny is at a particular point in time, and the way that he evolves across that decade, and the way that he reflects on the tumultuous life that he's had. I mean, I think there's something really powerful and potent to Danny's story. The fact that, with a record like Triple X, right there in the name, he started his career in his 30s. He
Mm-hmm.
started, so at the time where he emerged, he had already lived and gone through so much that he was able to put through into his art. And so you never really had this period of sort of nascent development for Danny. He arrived so ready, essentially. And so having lived and experienced so much. And those four records, I think, are all like, apart from being, you know, equal parts just ridiculously, horrifically grim and just gut-bustingly funny. All
Oh
four of
yeah.
those records, I think, are like both of those things, and to varying extents. But yeah, so Danny is just he is just the whole package. I mean, all of this is not even commenting on how technically incredible he is as a performer, how he not only is able to
Sensational.
modulate and move around through so many different, like quite complicated and quite, intense styles of delivery, in terms of like flows and cadences and things like that, but also the way in which he's able to just manipulate his own voice, and the way he's able to shift between these various different modes. I mean, like, you think of him, you think of the kind of almost cartoonish chipmunk squeak squeal that he rapped with primarily on Triple X as well, but then you get to records later on and you get moments where he showcases this like very stirring baritone that he has as well, that he's really
Yeah.
able to lean into. I just think that there's no single solo performer in the wider realm of alternative hip hop who had a better run, essentially, or who is more, I think, fascinating and exciting and artistically just defined than Danny. So yeah, we can't say enough good things about him. He's kind of been so swallowed up by, discourse around, like hip, cool, sort of indie approved rappers, but he has both that sort of, because he is a massive music nerd and he has that huge encyclopedic love of all kinds of music, from jazz and indie rock and alt rock and metal and all those sorts of things that feed into the way he constructs albums and the way he writes songs. But also he has this kind of hardcore hip hop allegiance as well, particularly going back to his ties, and his founding of Bruiser Brigade as well, and a real distinct hardcore hip hop background. So he just has everything. Like, there's just everything about him is enthralling and fascinating, and there's always new sides to Danny to discover. And
I have continued my journey through lots of canonical hip hop stuff, but the biggest one I got to were two albums that were made by Mr. Ghostface Killah of the Wu-Tang Clan. The first of which being the collaboration album between him and Bad Bad Not Good, Sour Soul, where he basically raps over a bunch of Bad Bad Not Good instrumentals. And this album is okay. It's good. You are constantly wishing that it was better while you're listening to it. That sounds kind of demeaning, but you're just like, you have that pedigree of just like Bad Bad Not Good, who certainly have become a little bit more like respectable as they've gone along, and have a bit better of a reputation for having some more like properly good albums nowadays, like the one we reviewed last year, for example. But they bring enough to the table. Ghostface, on the other hand, it's a bit mixed. This is a kind of slight project, and he's not doing anything like, there's the narrative ambition that he did when he did his collaborations with Adrian Young on the 12 Reasons to Die albums, which I fucking love those records. They're so good. Go listen to those. They're concept albums about Ghostface Killah being in the mafia. It's super great, super fun. But this is just an album that kind of just coasts on the fundamental talent of both of these, groups of people working together, and it's good. But like, when I hear a song that's MF Doom and Ghostface Killah rapping over a Bad Bad Not Good instrumental, I should be 5-starring that shit. Whereas in effect, it's just like, oh yeah, this is good. I mean, like, yeah, everybody's working well, but it's like nobody sounds particularly hungry. It's almost confident to the point of like lacking any sense of urgency. So I was a little bit let down by that, but I did go back and explore his first solo record, Iron Man. And I was eager to get to this one because I am a big fan of his second solo album, Supreme Clientele. I love that record. That's maybe my favorite Wu-Tang adjacent project that I've heard. And Iron Man is very good. I'd say that it definitely encounters all of the same, just the things that keep me at arm's length with a lot of classic 90s hip hop in general, and that, yeah, album's a bit too long. It kind of has a bit of a... Wu-Tang are not a group of people who I think necessarily thrive on the fact that they, have a lot of lyrical diversity necessarily. But even on here, it feels like everything's a bit too in its own lane. It just kind of feels like we're going through motions that have already been gone through at previous points on the record. So it feels like it gets a little bit thematically or lyrically repetitive at some points. And I got to give it up to people like Nas. We talked about him last week and how he's definitely at his worst when he, tries to rap about women. And, maybe I didn't give him enough credit, because I gotta at least say that he tries and has some good intentions with here. Whereas on Iron Man, the song Wildflower, the second song on here, is I would label it impressively misogynist. Like, again, I'm not like, oh, I'm triggered, oh, this bothered me. I was like laughing in hysterics because of how ridiculous this song is, and how it's just like, wow, like, when people say like, oh, they wouldn't get away with what they did in the past these days, I find that really annoying and boomery, but my God, you would not get away with a song like Wildflower these days. And like, he's just so intense and angry while rapping it that you're kind of like, all right, man, slow your roll just a little tiny bit, to the point where it does kill a lot of the enjoyment of the song for me. It does go pretty hard, so I can't say that is super bothersome, but it's a very good record overall. Not one of my favorites or anything, but I would certainly say it's worth listening to just because it's Ghostface and his Imperial era, where I mean, just like his flows were icy, he was absolutely menacing, and he just brings a quintessential attitude to the world of 90s hip hop that just feels irreplaceable. So that's, mileage may vary with it, but it's terrific.
It's hard as hell. I will unabashedly say I fucking adore those first two Ghostface records. I mean, Supreme Clientele, understandably, deservingly, it is held up as this kind of totem. I prefer Iron Man. It's funny, I actually think that Iron Man is actually a slightly more consistent and engaging record for me, although I will say I think it's less immediate. Maybe because like it just the general tone of Iron Man compared to Supreme Clientele, it's less bright, it's less kind of like just in your face with all the things that you would kind of go to from classic hip hop. It's just kind of less but then again, Supreme Clientele, it has songs like Woodrow the Basshead and Who Would You Fuck. I mean, there's actually a good amount of like just weird, bizarre shit on Supreme Clientele that I don't really care for. Whereas I just think that Iron Man is just front to back the best that Ghostface ever rapped, to be honest. I think he's insanely, intensely, I mean, and particularly the fact that it's basically a collaborative record with Capadonna and Raekwon as well. And I mean, RZA, yeah, they're on their heaps as well. It's just like, to me, it's kind of it's the whole package to me, that album. And yeah, I can understand it being a little bit.
It's a bit diminishing to say this, but it's basically also a Wu-Tang album. Like, it's just Wu-Tang if Ghostface took the reins more than anybody else, which I don't think that's demeaning to say because it's like totally as good as like Wu-Tang stuff. But yeah, Supreme Clientele is like, it is certainly a weirder record, and I think that is a perfect encapsulation of our values of this particular era of hip hop, whereas like you prefer the consistency and I prefer the just weirder, more out there shit. So perfect microcosm of that. And I would also like to say that the beat on Supreme Clientele is maybe the hardest beat of all time. That shit is great. And I know I need to listen to other Ghostface albums like Fish Scale still, so I'm eager to explore that world as well. And I guess, finally, I guess I will actually to backpedal just a tiny bit. The one consistent thing about Ghostface that I find both incredibly charming and very annoying is his almost ardent insistence to include a reference to swords in every single bar he can possibly put them in, just so he can say sword. Like, he has to say it like that. It's like in a contract somewhere. He's just like, I'm not pronouncing it sword. I'm going to say sword every single
like
time.
Two swords.
There's a part of like two swords. Yeah, exactly.
My absolute favorite hip hop album, Liquid Swords.
Swords. Last on the list here is I finally listened to a band that I have been hearing great things about from both Ryley and Connor for a very long time. A band that Connor really loves, that Ryley sort of broke the mold from with their album Frames earlier this year, I think. Whereas they told me that the album I should listen to from the band Oceansize, progressive rock and post-metal band Oceansize, their album Everyone Into Position. And basically Connor and Ryley were talking about this in the group chat in a way I can only figure was specifically designed in another group chat to get Morgan and I to listen to this album, just because every comparison you made, you're just like, oh, this song sounds like Deftones, oh, this sounds like Porcupine Tree, oh, this sounds like Opeth, oh, this sounds like, and I'm just like, every single time I was just like, all right, I get it.
I mean, okay, I can't do it. I won't deny that there wasn't an element of bait there, but like I was just genuinely like having an orgasmic response to this music, and all the reference points I kept thinking of were just like things that you had gotten me into, and so it was just this weird moment where I was just like completely in the middle of something so much like bigger than my own tastes, and it was just like this real full circle moment I was not expecting Because yeah, I'm a huge fan of Frames, which is much more kind of leans much more into the kind of post rock side of things. It's kind of a little bit more like oh, I had a really good comparison for this and now it's gone. But like, it's everyone into position is like the really explosive, more metallic, really heavy, intense sort of prog record, whereas Frames is a little bit more like the talk side of prog, kind of. It still gets pretty loud and at points and still gets pretty fiery, but it's much more, sort of built around sort of like building to these moments of catharsis, from a quieter
Sigur
place.
Rós was another band you compared it
Yeah.
to, which
Whereas
was, I think, maybe the tipping point for actually getting me to listen to it.
So that's kind of what Frames is, whereas everyone in the position is kind of just like, it's really loud the entire time. Like it's just, it starts at this massive place of just intensity and heft and just kind of maintains that for like 70 minutes, more or less. And so like, it's just such a maximalist record. And I was not expecting that. And it really took me by surprise.
Yeah, I was like, and like there were other comparisons to shit like Tool and what have you, and I was just like, all right, I gotta sit down and fucking just listen to this shit. And the length is certainly probably what kept me at a distance from this band just for a while, just because getting into a band is difficult when like, oh, the entry point for their discography is 65 minutes long. But thing is that this record is paced really, really fucking well, and I mean, Jesus Christ. Songs like an homage to shame, I mean, again, that's pure Deftones worship in the best possible ways. Atmospheric as fuck alt metal, sounds fucking great. Music for a Nurse, I think maybe is the most like infamous song on this album. And my God,
I described
8 minutes
this
of
song,
bliss.
I described this song in a group chat as it's like every single song on A Good Beginning by Sigur Rós, their second album, if you played every single song at the same time and then just like put some like OK Computer era Tom York style vocals on top of it, like, that's just what that song is. It's like the most intense, beautiful, and just like heartbreaking song, like heavy song that you can imagine, basically. I mean, frontman Mike Venner, this is the thing, like, a great metal band. I think, Tool and Porcupine Tree always get kind of talked about in this kind of like binary, or is this kind of like polarity of like prog metal or whatever. And Oceansize to me are kind of like, they're like the middle point between those two bands.
Oh,
I think. And a song like Music for a Nurse is where you get a connection from the world of prog metal to the world of prog and post rock in a way that I think makes Oceansize a really good band to get into if you're wanting to explore the world of bands like that. I just think that it's really hard to go wrong, and they're just like, and the thing is like, I think maybe another one of the reasons why I just go so hard for them every single time I'm listening to them in terms of just like, raving about them, is just that they're such an underrated band. Like they made 4 like staggering, like all beloved albums in the 2000s. Then they kind of just disbanded after that. And now it's kind of like, I guess maybe they came a little bit later than some of the bands they get compared to. So they're just kind of a little bit lost in the shuffle.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I've only heard the 2 albums so far, but I'm going to listen to the other 2, and I'm sure I will have strong feelings on those regardless. But yeah, they're one of the bands this week, and there have been a few, but they're one of the bands this week that really gave me this like cathartic experience that I really needed.
Yeah. I would say that they are a band that contain the emotional catharsis of Deftones, but like the instrumental palette of a Porcupine Tree. And you say that out loud, and it's just like, wow, I bet Jake really likes this. And I mean, like, no duh, right? But like, they really are like one of the bands I've heard where like they are kind of closest to Porcupine Tree in a way that doesn't feel like pure like derivativeness, where it's just like, oh well, I can get this from my other band that I have over here. It's like, no, that these guys do different things structurally, both with their songs and their albums and their sound, that's a bit more far-reaching than like Tool, for example. It really is like Porcupine Tree if you applied the Sigur Rós like song structures to them, but with like a Deftones palette. So if you are a fan of like literally any band we just mentioned, you are now, your assignment is to go and listen to everyone into position and then eventually frames. But this was a great record. At least, I mean, I haven't heard any of their other stuff yet, but it got me really, really interested. I mean, from the merit of its highlights alone, which it never drops the ball, but like shit like An Homage to Shame, Music for a Nurse, and No Tomorrow are just like immortal 2000s prog rock shit for me. So I can't wait to explore the rest of this band's discography.
Jen, anything you want to shout out that you've been listening to this week?
I went on a quest of sorts this week to answer the question for myself, because I was feeling a little nostalgic for this band. What is the best 1975 album? And
okay, I mean, I don't. I guess maybe Jake doesn't, but I have an opinion on that question.
I mean, I definitely
I figured
do.
you would.
I know you do, Jake, but probably not as passionately as I do.
Obviously, this year we had the arrival of Being Funny in a Foreign Language, which has made me kind of reflect on the discography of a band that this is going to sound so cringy. When I was in high school, I listened to a lot.
Oh, fucking same, man. We're all in the same boat.
That's one of the most like commonly said sentences on this podcast. So don't ever feel
we are all literally the same person. Jen and I are from the same state.
There's no
queer NBs who listen to indie rock way too much.
Yeah, you can't either love or hate the 1975 too much for this podcast. There's no take on that band that you should feel any level of compunction towards. And I am very, and I say this as someone who is on the record as being, you know, more of a defender than anything else of their music. But anyway, I want to hear your take.
I'm also more of a defender, and I went back and listened to their first 3 albums. I obviously had Being Funny fresh in my mind. I knew the answer was not going to be the last one, the one before that one, so I didn't bother. But I went back and listened to their self-titled I Like It When You Sleep and A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships. And for me, the jury is still out between I Like It When You Sleep and A Brief Inquiry. And this is why. The self-titled I like a whole lot. I think it's a really good, straightforward synth pop album. But with I Like It When You Sleep and A Brief Inquiry, the band gets a little bit braver, a little bit more exploratory in a way that doesn't become overwhelming, like on Notes on a Conditional Form, where they're just doing way too much. Those two albums, I feel like, have a good mix of straightforward jams and a bit more out there art poppy stuff. And I don't know, I can find all these little minute details between the two of them that, you know, If I Believe You on I Like It When You Sleep is probably my favorite 1975 song in general.
Which is a gorgeous fucking song.
Yeah. But I think that A Brief Inquiry is tighter, even in its moments where it's not as tight. I love the opening, like 5-6 tracks of Brief Inquiry. I'm gonna hop in on this, please.
I'll clear up my take here. My favorite 1975 album is absolutely their second record. I have a complicated relationship with Brief Inquiry. When it came out, I was like super into it, and the flaws of that record have really become more and more egregious as time's gone on. That said, I think that there are songs on that record that are overhated. There's actually quite a few that I see people shitting on, and I'm like, you know what? I actually really like that song. And I think in general, the run of songs that is on the first half of that record is actually, you know, it's not necessarily their best sequence of material, but I am more or less ride or die for all of it. I think the big issue of that record is much more when you get into the back half of it and you get some of the, like, the ambition to kind of branch out their sound and to kind of explore more things is still there. And more often than not, it's admirable, but you really do get some of their biggest failures of exploring new territory in some of those moments as well. And it really just tears me up inside.
The second half of that record, I'm like you, is what holds it back for me. But the run from the opening all the way to I Like America and America Likes Me, I think is stellar. It really is that back half that I'm just like, but I
I
will
Like
say, I will
America
say.
and America Likes Me is like my third or fourth favorite Playboy Cardi song.
I will say it probably has my favorite like ending track on a
Oh,
1975
it's
album, which is
so
I Always
good.
Wanted to Die Sometimes.
And that's such a fucking like pure indie rock worship, but like in a very sort of hipstery perks of being a wallflower indie rock kind of way. That song is like just love it.
The back half is definitely saved by I Couldn't Be More in Love and I Always Want to Die Sometimes, at least for me.
I Couldn't Be More in Love is a good song, definitely. I'm really fond of my favorite song on the back half is probably Inside Your Mind, weirdly enough, which is a bit more of a like, I guess, a divisive song, just because it reminds me a lot of a band that I really love, which is that no one ever talks about anymore, very peak 2014 indiecore, Magical Clouds, super evoked by that song. But also I am kind of a sucker for the songs where Matt Healy kind of portrays himself a little bit as a serial killer. I just find that I just find that to be kind of alluring. But basically all you need to know about the flaws of this album is summed up by the fact that there's a song on it that's named after the like a segment of the first sentence of Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, which is surrounded by heads and bodies. But look, I would like that album considerably more if well, okay, the worst song on any of their albums easily, The Man Who Married a Robot. Like, come on,
Yeah,
give me a fucking break with this bullshit. If that were cut, definitely. If the offensively mediocre attempt at lounge jazz that is Mine were cut as well, I would like it a little bit more. Like, again, respect for attempting to do a lounge jazz song, guys, but this is like it feels almost like it is making fun of lounge jazz as opposed to kind of like pastiching it in a cool sort of 1975-y way. So that's, yeah, those are my biggest issues, is just that it's a colossal mess of a record, but I'm still more positive than negative. It's just I have such a weird relationship with that album.
For me,
But
like I said, the jury is still out between I Like It When You Sleep and A Brief Inquiry. Both have their perks, both have their flaws. With I Like It When You Sleep, I just think there's one too many instrumental interludes. I think it could be tightened up a little bit. I don't think Lost in My Head is as interesting as it thinks it is.
I love that song. That's like when they go like full on.
I like that song.
I what's the other one? No, the title track, that's the one where it really starts to falter for me, because it's like 6.5 minutes that sound like nothing between two of the best songs on the album. Loving Someone and The Sound.
Oh God, the sound.
Morgan and I have
what an immortal song.
Morgan and I have basically stated this already, and we're both like we're both in this weird position where, and it feels unique for both of us, I guess, especially for Morgan, where it's like, this is a 17 song, 74-minute album by the 1975 that both of us basically wholeheartedly agree we would not cut a single song from. And that's just a strange place to be in. But the album just has too much of a connection to me, to when it came out 2016. It was like a new stage of my life and shit. I just listened to this shit so fucking much. And I kind of can't actually make a case for it not being too long or too kind of overwrought, but I don't know. I really appreciate the ebb and flow of it. I think structurally, given that all these songs are here, they're arranged and sequenced about as well as they possibly could be. But I also kind of enjoy the fact that it sort of ends in a more sort of emotional place with songs like Paris and Nana and She Lays Down, which are like, you wouldn't think that Matty Healy could possibly like pull off genuine pathos, like completely unironically. And yet he really does there in a way that makes it feel like a kind of like, as you spend all this time with him across the run of that record, it's almost like a kind of reward for indulging him to a certain extent, is that he actually opens himself up to you. And I think that, you know, if we ever do a record club on this someday, I might talk about this in more depth. But I think that conceptually, there's actually a really interesting structural art to this album, where it starts off with the most kind of like artificial, plasticky songs that are like most boldly about like fame and about like, you know, this, where Maddie in songs like Love Me and Ugh, he like really presents himself as this kind of like, you know, plastic, you know, heroin addicted sort of like, you know, just facile figure essentially. And as the album goes on, he kind of like, it's not that he kind of, you know, pulls back all those layers necessarily, but it's just that they all kind of start to just kind of collapse essentially, and you get more and more glimpses of a kind of really vulnerable and just sort of helpless little person inside of him. And it doesn't feel like the kind of thing that is put on either. Although maybe even if it did, I don't even think I'd have a problem with it, because that's just kind of, you know, everything's about performance with Maddie Healy. But I don't know, there's moments on this record where like the first album is so absorbed with that, like, you know, the facile existence of being famous, and then like there's great songs about like existing in that facile space and then like trying to negotiate relationships with other people. Like Change of Heart and She's American are like such hilarious songs about like the fakeness of, you know, relationships and of sex and of all that kind of stuff when you are essentially in this place where everything is a transaction. And then like also the subtext as well of Maddie's like genuinely crippling heroin addiction, and the way that that bleeds into songs like Ballad of Me and My Brain and Somebody Else as well. And
I spent so many nights being sad and heartbroken listening to Somebody Else.
Yeah.
God,
Yeah.
I almost can't go back to that song
Jake, we're the
and
same
listen to it,
person.
because
I mean,
it was introduced to me at the most critical mass, enduring heartbreak after heartbreak moment in my life, and I was just like, I listened to it like every day for like a year, and I was probably so insufferable.
I mean, indulge me here, right? Like there might be, if I really think about it, there might be others that are much more obscure that I maybe like a little bit more. But I mean, I think Somebody Else is the breakup song of the 2010s. Like to me, it's just
totally
in every respect. It's like
up there.
You know, I just it is pervaded and moved into, and like, because it wasn't even a single, it's just a deep cut essentially. They did release, just incidentally, they did release a very funny and absurd David Lynch rip-off music video for it, which I have a great deal of fondness for, even though it doesn't suit the song at all. But anyway, it was just this deep cut song that everyone who heard this album just completely gravitated towards, buried essentially right in the middle of the record, and some of its most unfriendly and unpoppy songs. And it's just kind of like sitting there as this just oasis of pure pain. And I listened to that shit a million times that year and ever since. Really, like, that song is so enduring. And it's not even my favorite on the record. Like, I think, to me, the absolute pinnacle of everything the 1975 are, like the greatest 1975 song, although there's definitely some contenders from their first album, which is incidentally the other one this competes for. I think I'd much prefer the first album to the album that came after this, even if it is less ambitious. I just think there's a better ratio of great songs on it. But the definitive 1975 song for me is The Sound, which is just like, that song is just,
it's so nice to be on the same wavelength with you about this fucking band. Finally,
that song is just like, it is the most IMAX scale pop song they ever made. It's huge.
Oh god.
It's also like lyrically really funny and really kind of, you know, satirical and just, but also at the same time, like, you know, this is, like I said, again, this is the kind of part of the record where the fakeness of it all is kind of just just melting away essentially, and that's just the last bastion of everything that's so like just fascinating and tongue-in-cheek, but also like really real about that 1975. I mean, it's the thing, like, Maddie Healy obfuscates this a lot, and even though I wasn't a huge fan of their new record, it's admittedly something he did try to do a bit better on the new record, which is to, you know, just be a little bit more direct and write songs that are kind of just more uncomplicatedly about his desperate need for affection. But to me, he was never better at writing about that than he is on this album. And it's so enduring to me for that reason. Like, yeah, I mean, everything about their debut, the first album, which is, it's much more constructed, or I guess it's much more like just, if you were being less charitable, you could say it's just another sort of Tumblr core indie band sort of like, writing these really sort of basic pop songs. But I don't subscribe to that belief at all. I actually think that the songwriting quality of their debut is generally really great. And there are songs on that album like Sex and Robbers and Girls that
Robbers.
I absolutely just fucking adore. The City, and I mean, shit, there's so many good songs on that one. I will always have this incredible level of affection for this band because of how much that music meant to me at that time, but also because I think that when they want to, and this will always probably be true of them, regardless of whether they choose to, they can write some of the most like genuinely like life-affirming and just truly exciting pop music.
At their best, they sound like Let's Dance era David Bowie updated for the modern world. And the reason why that's great is because that's David Bowie's sellout album, which means that he did that once, and we only have one album of him doing that. So now we have a band that could theoretically explore an entire land of possibilities of the sellout David Bowie era, which is a great era of music, by the way. Like, I mean, fucking Love Me is like modern love for the 2010s. Change my mind.
What you've just put in my head now is that I desperately want this band to cover China Girl, just because I think that would be so funny. Like it would be such a them thing for them to do as well, and it would just be really funny.
God!
And I want that to happen now.
Oh man,
yeah, I had actually made the Let's Dance connection, but that's such a great connection because not even just in terms of how that record sounds and how the 1975 sound, but like the whole attitude behind that record as well, the way that Bowie approached that album, and how you can tell that he's doing it because he wants to, obviously, but also there's this kind of like it's a sort of a cynical and kind of misanthropic album a little bit, and it's kind of there's a little bit of just a kind of there's an attitude in that album of just like, it's not that Bowie doesn't respect the music he's making, but also just kind of like there's just a cynicism to him in that era that I find actually quite appealing. Anyway, that's another tangent entirely, but yeah.
The last thing I want to shout out is the new album from math pop outfits Polyphia. Remember That You Will Die, it's called. This is, well, like I said, it's a math pop album, but it works in a lot of different avenues. It combines a lot of different musical signatures, especially since it's primarily an instrumental.
Looking at their genre tags. Holy moly.
Yeah. It's primarily an instrumental album, but they have a really good way of working with vocalists that they have featured in a way that really contributes to their album construction. So, for example, they have a song with a young up-and-coming Japanese vocalist named Sophia Black that is very like bubblegum pop, but also has that love of like odd time signatures and really fast electric guitar riffs that are really high pitched that go really well with her vocals. And then there's the song towards the end of the album that features Gina Moreno, and it sounds like a fucking prog rock song, and it's great. It's really like washed out and compressed in a way that sounds good. And the second half of that song, Chino's vocals get really layered in reverb, and it just sounds great. I love the way this
holy
band
fuck, there's a Steve Vai solo on this album?
I just saw that. Yeah, that's
holy shit.
Yeah. There's and the song featuring Snot, who I've never listened to before, so I don't really have an opinion on this guy. But it has like a trap beat, but the primary instrument that they're playing over it is like a flamenco guitar. It's so weird. There's so many great levels of instrumentation and rhythm and time signature on this. It will likely only grow on me more because I just listened to it yesterday. As I revisit it, I'm sure I will find even more to love about this.
It seems like this seems like a band that would be very like just an experience to listen to. I definitely want to like just see what on earth this could possibly actually sound like. No, that's sick.
That's it for me.
Trap, EDM, jazz fusion, and math rock. What the fuck?
And flamenco. let's not overlook the flamenco.
Oh.
All right. Well, let's get into the first review of the day, which is the new album from Richard Dawson, The Ruby Chord. Now, Richard Dawson is a really interesting artist that we have reviewed on this show before. In fact, the year feels in some ways as though it's coming full circle on itself, because the last Richard Dawson project, Henki, which was a collaboration with the Finnish prog band Circle, that album Henki, which came out at the very end of last year, we reviewed that at the very start of this year, and it was, if you know anything about Richard, it's a very Richard Dawson record. Like, what the thing about Richard is that he's an incredibly verbose writer who is fascinated with incredibly niche things, and also is able to draw parallels between these niche things, or between like aspects of nature or aspects of, inanimate objects essentially, and is able to draw parallels between those things in some kind of broader meaning about the way in which the world has changed in the history of human existence, and the way in which he believes it is changing and will change. He is just a really fascinating artist. Like that album, for instance, there was a concept song on that album that was from the perspective of a seed, like as it kind of like was frozen in amber for thousands of years essentially. And that tells you a lot about Richard's interests. He's kind of like a social anthropologist sort of writer, but he does a really good job of showcasing and writing about these aspects of, sociocultural history, human behavior, human fascinations, human fetishes, human fixations, in a way that really avoids all the pitfalls, all the obvious points of reference for those topics. And he's always able to take these topics and find an interesting new spin on it. Now, I will preface the additional context I'm about to give with the fact that Richard has kind of tried to step away from this view of his recent work, but essentially his last two solo albums, Peasant and 2020, records which I consider to be two of the best albums of the 2010s, are kind of a part of an unofficial trilogy essentially. And this is kind of the way that they've been packaged, and kind of the way that they are written, and thematically what they're interested in. And it's essentially a trilogy about human existence across history, and not just human existence as well, but human culture, human behavior, the interaction between humans and their environment, and the ever-present and constant search for some form of fulfillment in your existence, essentially. And the thing that makes it a trilogy is that each of these records ostensibly approach these topics from a different historical viewpoint. So Peasant is a record that is a concept record about medieval England. All the songs are set in like the, 1400s, 1500s, and the slums of medieval England, this kind of like, Bellatar, Turin horse-esque, oppressive landscape of repetitive existence. Songs about war, songs like, and every song on that record was kind of named for an occupation, essentially, or a place in the culture or society that the subject of the song existed as. So there's soldier, prostitute, scientist, ogre, herald, all these sorts of songs that gave you this distinct and very intimate.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just thought you said like the name Herald and not like the job Herald. I was just like,
soldier,
everyone's
prostitute,
favorite scholar,
herald,
soldier, prostitute, and herald.
Yes, scholar, soldier, prostitute, Dave, all that sort of thing. No, but yeah, so each of the songs on that record was essentially embodying a particular perspective, And this is the thing about all three of these albums, is every single song is kind of a first-person perspective song about a character, essentially. And through the course of that song, it's like a short story, right? His albums are kind of like short story collections where you get a little taste of their life, essentially a day in their life, and it gives you and from that you're able to extrapolate some broader meaning about and understanding, at least, of the culture that this person exists within, the class as well, stratification, all these sorts of things. So Peasant, the first album in the trilogy, probably still the best album in the trilogy, although I think they're all great. 2020, the second album in the trilogy, which came out confusingly in 2019, but nonetheless. So if Peasant was this kind of distinct concept record set in medieval England, 2020 is set in the present day. It's a concept record about, it's similarly, individual perspectives of individual people living their lives in modern England, essentially. And the songs aren't, they don't have the same sort of formal structure of being about particular occupations, but they are about particular scenarios, individuals in usually some kind of mundane aspect of their existence. Like there's a song on there called Fulfillment Center about a dude who works at an Amazon fulfillment center. There's a song on there called Heart Emoji, which is an incredibly funny song about a guy who is like completely disaffected in his relationship, who accidentally discovers that his wife is cheating on him because she sees a heart emoji from some random person on her phone. There's a song called, probably Richard's most famous song, called Two Halves, which is a song about like the experience of being a kid whose dad is kind of dragging you to football practice, essentially. And this father figure is like put so much of his personal meaning and worth in his son being good at football, essentially. But also it's kind of a song about the hubris of the son as well. Like one of the most famous lyric is like, you're not fucking Messi or whatever. And it's just this really like funny song, essentially, about the relationship between this father and son who are, embedded in this like cultural institution of football in England. There's a song on there called Jogging, my favorite song on that record, which is just about a dude who decides one day that he's going to like get into shape, and he just starts like, going for runs around his neighborhood, essentially, and just commenting on the random bizarre people he encounters. The album is amazing, and it's just beautiful stories of modern England, essentially, where all the aspects that make it modern are subtext. None of it is labored in any way. It's all just it's like a Robert Altman Shortcuts-esque portrait, except it's just distinctly English. And that's one of the really cool things about that record. And I think it's one of the best albums of the decade for that reason. And so now we have the Ruby Chord, which is ostensibly the final album in this trilogy, but is much more obtuse in its subject matter than those two records are. And this is a very purposeful decision on Richard's part, right? I've read some interviews with him in the lead up to this, and he's kind of tried to not backpedal, but just try to like slightly deflate the narrative that this trilogy of records are very distinctly a past, present, future type of thing. Like in Richard's view, these are all just records about human beings in distinct contexts across distinct periods, but none of them are necessarily uniquely his view of a particular point in time. Like he will use history, he'll use culture, he'll use all these sorts of things as ways of coloring these stories, but they're never restricted to any one context. And that, I think, is especially true of the Ruby Chord, which is, it is set in the 26th century, I believe. I think that is the way in which this is conceptually framed. More or less broadly, these songs are set 500 years into the future. But it's not this like, it's interesting, like the aesthetics of the way in which Richard goes about depicting these stories in this context, and the language that he uses as well, the way he writes these songs, it does a really, really great job of avoiding the kind of trappings and obvious cliches and just really played out depictions of, futuristic dystopia. This is a record that is not explicitly set in a post-apocalyptic landscape, but very clearly these songs exist in either the distant or near to distant wake of some kind of event, essentially, that has broken society down, more or less, or has resulted in a return to some kind of primitive living. But it's a primitive living where aspects of, you know, sort of futuristic technology and the ability to do things like, you know, see into new dimensions, essentially, or modify your body, or all these kinds of things, are just mundane aspects of that environment that exist, that certain characters kind of sometimes stumble into as they're navigating. And so you have this interesting, like, dynamic, bizarre, like, setting that's this kind of, like, you know, swampy, very, like, you know, there's a lot of references to nature, and so it feels almost like a kind of a record that's set in, you know, like languorous English fields and all that sort of thing, in a similar way to something like Peasant, but just like this decayed version of that landscape where, you know, futuristic technology just goes hand in hand with, you know, the primitive return to nature, you know, circumstance that whatever unknown event has thrusted however many humans are left into this space, essentially. It's just this, it's difficult to get a clear picture of this environment, which is funny because it's incredibly descriptive about the environment. And a song like the colossal 40-minute The Hermit, especially, you know, so much of that song is about vividly coloring this environment in this incredibly poetic and frankly stunning way. It takes quite a lot of time to unpack, and Richard spends a lot of time lingering in details that feel like they don't necessarily connect to the overarching narrative of the song, but they give you more of a picture of what is happening, essentially, or of what the place that it's set in. And so in that respect, the Ruby Chord, while these three albums are all about people, and this is no exception, these are definitely stories about individual people, and there's a lot of pathos in them, and at times they can be brutally sad. It's also a record about the environment every bit as much as it is about people. And it's about the symbiotic relationship between the environment and the people, the dependence that people have on the resources that are available to them, but also the ways in which those resources and those, you know, aspects of the environment are also oppressive and, you know, can take people away from you as much as they can, you know, provide a landscape for you to exist and be supported. There are stories of, you know, parents and children, you know, like The Tip of an Arrow, for instance, incredible storytelling on that song, where the environment is both the source of the sustenance that these people have and is something that is to be revered and drawn from with respect, but also something which callously can take away everything you have in a moment. And so the whole record, which is 80 minutes long, as most of you probably know at this point, exists in this state of unfixed, just permanence, like just this sense, not permanence, but just kind of like stillness, almost, essentially, where the you know, where an individual's day-to-day life, you know, the 24 hours in a day for one person, they might only do one thing in that period. They might, and that might just be walking, you know, across, you know, a landscape, taking in the sort of digital sunrise and eventually discovering a dead body, which is the entirety of everything that happens in The Hermit. Or, you know, you might be getting a song that is a fifth of that length that covers the entire relationship between two people as they navigate this environment across their entire lives. So I'll stop it there for now. It's a big album in like so many different senses. It is not a friendly record at all. I think this is, as someone who's gone back into Richard's back catalog and really immersed myself in everything he's done, I'd say this is by far the least friendly thing he's made, not just because of its length, but because of how just, I don't want to say punishingly, because that has a negative connotation. I don't feel it to be punishingly, but also just how grindingly slow this is. And it has to be, because that's so much integral to the effect that, and to putting you into this landscape. Like the landscape itself is, you know, it's so defined by its emptiness, its hollowness. And so the way in which Richard constructs these songs and writes these songs and draws them out is like, it's going to be a thing that holds you at a distance or makes it maybe difficult to get into this record, but ultimately it's also the thing that makes it as immersive as it is, and it makes the places and the people and the things in this record feel as well realized as they are, at least in my view anyway. I'm happy. I would love to hear if you disagree, or if you have a different take, or even if you agree, what your perspective is on it, because the way in which Richard tells stories here, the way in which Richard puts you into landscapes and just gives you little ephemera and details that let you kind of piece together a fragmented and incomplete story about a mysterious future, essentially. I find it to be utterly fascinating and so intellectually stimulating, in that how it kind of really makes me like pay attention to and focus in on how Richard's describing these environments, what he's writing about, and what, you know, is written in between the lines as well, in terms of what he's not saying explicitly, but that we can infer about these stories and about these places and about this particular vision of what the future might look like.
Well, remember, I'm not as like storied of a Richard Dawson enjoyer as Ryley here is, but that said, I enjoyed his last album quite a fair bit. I enjoyed everything about it, even his occasionally a bit grating vocal presence. I think that was Morgan's largest sticking point with it, just kind of didn't allow him a barrier for entry. But I personally could kind of get on board with it because it sort of felt part and parcel with the kind of medieval presentation of all of it. So there's some kind of, no matter what he's writing about, be it past, present, or future, Dawson has this kind of archaic sort of aesthetic to everything he does that makes it feel so kind of primal, that I feel like his vocals really kind of suit to that. And let me tell you, first things first, that if you couldn't gel with his vocals on the last album, you are not going to think any differently here, because if anything, they are even more eccentrically performed, even though I would say that, like, because so much of this album is so dense and a lot of these songs are on the longer side, there are lots of more moments where he's like not even there, it'll just be an instrumental. But even still, the performances themselves are a very, you know, I would say that, right, like Ryley said, they are kind of charismatic, which I think kind of anchors them in a sort of tangibility that maybe some other vocalist like Dawson wouldn't manage to be able to pull off well. But I have a peculiar opinion of this album that I think is a little bit different than what most people seem to think, and that I really do like The Hermit, the opening song, the 41-minute song. I think that it's very beautiful. I love the sort of shuffling stateliness of the kind of first half. I love the kind of rise that it builds to in its final third that really is really very dense, really very satisfying of a payoff. However, I do think that this song at 41 minutes maybe is a song that perhaps does not need to be 41 minutes long. I think that maybe being 35, 30 minutes long probably could get across everything that he wants to do here instrumentally. It feels a little bit bloated. And I know, fucking 40-minute long song, of course you're going to criticize it for being too long. Well, yeah, no shit, genius. Thing is here is that it does feel like it repeats and cycles through a few of the same ideas a little bit too often, especially there at the end. I just feel like you can do this structural choice a little bit better, even though I think it's done well. And I actually end up preferring the cuts that follow after it. It seems to be that most people really, really love the first song, which accounts for really the first half of the record, and they feel more or less like, oh, the other songs are good, but that's the highlight. For me, on the other hand, I find the writing to be really engaging and a little bit more conceptual. Like, The Hermit really does sort of establish the kind of like post-apocalypse that this kind of takes place within, and it doesn't really like, I do think Thicker Than Water is a compelling song, but it doesn't until The Fool, the third track, where this album really starts to hit home for me in the same way that the conceptual edge of Hanky really hit me. It's really just in the fact that, like, The Fool in concept is a song about someone, you know, in a terrible world in a town where pretty much he feels a sort of ire for his fellow man, who he kind of paints as like being sort of, you know, like troglodytes in comparison, with a bit of a nasty attitude towards his fellow man, but kind of finding solace in a relationship that's eventually broken. And you think to yourself, just like, oh yeah, that's a pretty basic idea for a song, but it's really the way in which Dawson paints everything. Like the opening verse here: I play the role of a fool, the townfolk's fulcrum of ridicule, oft to appear through prisming beer to the newly arrived here, not as I am, but how they prefer. And it's like, is that doing anything that's, you know, particularly unique in terms of like what he's talking about? No, but the meter, the wordplay here, I really think it's exceptional. The way he tells this story is super compelling, and it leads to having a particularly heartbreaking conclusion. It really hits home, and I think that's also exemplified off of the next track, which is my favorite thing on here, Museum, which is interesting just because it's kind of lyrically the most minimal thing here. It's really kind of relays more on its instrumental qualities to tell its story emotionally a bit more than the lyricism. But the way I see it is, the museum here is sort of an instrumental and slight lyrical pontification on the past from the perspective of the future. You sort of get this like vibe of someone walking into a museum where the museum is featuring things that we would probably see as contemporary, or at least closer to our past, like people fighting in wars and stuff like that. All of these big grand concepts that are rendered into these small little things that you view through windows or panes of glass, just isolated and just very emotionally wrought in how they're portrayed as being these really tiny itty bitty little things.
And what I love about that,
like pointless.
it's like, and this just occurred to me on my most recent listen, and I'm like, I was so annoyed that it didn't hit me sooner. It's like, this song is obviously a metaphor for social media, right? Like, it's just a metaphor
absolutely.
for what the experience of social media is like. But it takes that very, like, you know, bog standard concept for a song and just makes it so much more potent and kind of like tragic by just envisioning how, just as we experience the world now through the lens of social media, where everything that happens is equal, you know, like, you know, a horrible, you know, a hospital bombing that kills 300 people takes up as much of our brain space and has as much weight in our existence as, you know, who the fuck Pete Davidson is dating at the moment. You know what I mean? And this song is kind of the same sort
without
of thing.
coming across as like overbearing with the whole social media thing. Like that's the thing, is that you have to let that sit with you to even realize that that's kind of what that song's about. It's not just being like, fucking screen's bad. It's like, no, it's the concept of rendering a real life experience, a real actual thing that something happened, and then like inherently the sort of tragedy we have. It's not even just about like social media and stuff. It's about memory. It's about how once things are in the past, once things have happened, our attempt to sort of relay what they were like and what they were and all of the details of them is going to come across as like so incredibly facile in comparison to what they actually were, to the point where you could even comment on the fact that this might be a microcosm of what he's doing on his albums on this song, and like this is a representation of what he is attempting to do with this sort of trilogy of records, or with this record in particular. And I think that's a really smart, dense, very Richard Dawsonian sort of concept to make a song even about in the first place. And I respect how he lets the instruments tell the story more like mood wise than he does necessarily the lyricism here. Like, I think this is one of my favorite sounding songs on the album, save for the very, very, very good closer, Horse and Rider. This is as exciting, I think, as this album gets instrumentally for me, which is a bit of a double-edged sword, I'll admit. I think that when Dawson had the band behind him on the last record, that added a kind of vitality that I will admit is not here as much. I don't want to like downplay the album's instrumentation, because it's thoughtful, it's composed well, Like a lot of it's really subtle, but a lot of it too is really like forward in terms like in stuff like the closer. But it doesn't quite have the same kind of vitality for me that the last record had. And I know that's probably more or less due to the fact that the concept is more indebted to this kind of futuristic wasteland where everything's isolated, very kind of T.S. Eliot kind of shit. And I understand that, but there are moments here where things are a bit more muted than I think they need to be in order to still fulfill the atmosphere and vibe that they've got going for them. This is a very strange album to process and to think about. And in many respects, it's an album that I kind of like thinking about a little bit more than I like actually listening to, even though I do actually enjoy listening to it. But it is very big. It is very unwieldy. And I think that you can have many structural problems with it. I don't really have those issues. But then again, it's very much an instance of your mileage may vary. Like, I don't know. Like, I couldn't recommend this confidently to like anybody. I can just say that you're going to walk away with an interesting experience. I can't say whether or not you as an individual will like it. But that said, I think there's too much interesting content here to like ignore this in any respect and say it's like, oh, it's just for Dawson fans. Like, no, I think this is something that you owe it to yourself to listen to it, just because there's so much to be mined here from the writing. And regardless of what I feel about the instrumentation of the album, I still think it is good. I still think it is thoughtful. It just doesn't hit me quite as hard as Circle's contribution to the last record did. So I do think this is a very good record that I enjoy a whole lot. It just has a lot of tinier, kind of smaller bugbears. Hell, I even enjoy the instrumental track on here that nobody seems to really particularly care for. Like, I won't say it's a standout moment, but I like what it does thematically as a sort of bridge to the final moment of the record.
And the thing about that, actually, just on that note, is that all three of these albums have a song called No One on them. And the point of those songs is that because every other song on these three albums is a first-person perspective song, essentially, a story that is being told, something, a situation or an environment or something that someone is embedded within, and you, through the course of the song, learn about their emotional state or how they're surviving. And then the point of No One is that because this is a trilogy of records essentially about time and about environments across time, the No One songs are supposed to essentially be a musical or at least a sonic representation of the ambient landscapes of those places. And I think that in that sense, the No One track here is actually maybe the most effective of the No One songs on any of the albums, because like it allows you a moment, in between these stories to breathe, but also to like really get a quite, what I find to be a quite evocative little piece of droning music that feels as though it really does a great job of tying together the sounds and the musical aspects of this record that represent, the degraded history, the ancient sort of past that's kind of collapsed, and also the digitized sheen of the technology that essentially has brought about that destruction and now exists equally broken down. Like the bridge between the synthetic and the ornate, the classical, is subtly, admittedly, but it is kind of highlighted there, and I appreciate that Richard does that. I think maybe musically the song on the record that is the most sort of outward at kind of using music to represent that kind of collapse and collision of the futuristic, the synthetic, the computerized, and the ornate, the natural, the earthy, is the Fool, because that song has got so much electronic sounds and just detritus and noise in it. It's an incredibly frenzied song musically, and it's just actually quite overwhelming. The first time I heard that song, I was like, what the fuck is happening here musically?
Oh yeah,
it's just so nutso. But I like that Richard doesn't kind of rely too much on those kind of clunky juxtapositions. I think if every song on here were kind of like, and here's how the electronic is colliding with the, earthy and ornate, it would kind of be a little bit too much. One of the things I've come to really appreciate about this record is that, and I completely get that this is a limitation for a lot of people, and it just is. But the sheer suspended length of this really lets me feel as though I can actually in some mental way kind of transport into these places and feel what it is like to be purely surviving. Because this album is all these songs really are just about surviving more than living, right? These songs are about what people do in their day-to-day life, essentially to have purpose and to sustain themselves. And sometimes it's more explicit, like The Tip of an Arrow, which is my favorite song from a narrative perspective on this album, which is about, this parent and child essentially who are basically, who've established this routine of hunting to survive, but their hunting ritual is so like bizarre and gives Dawson a chance to showcase the ways in which this landscape has kind of fused together the detritus of everything that is left. So yeah, you have stories like that give you a little bit more of an overt way of being immersed in that place as well. But then you do have songs like Museum or songs like Thicker Than Water, which is maybe the most like, this is going to sound disparaging. I don't mean it to be. It's the closest this album gets to being like Black Mirror-esque. But Dawson never, ever leans into the kind of like just sheer bald-faced obviousness of that. But I mean, this is a genuinely like emotional song, Thicker Than Water, where you're basically like the story of this person who is like confronting the fact that they never really had a chance to say goodbye to their family before their family essentially chose to live inside of this digital sustaining machine that basically killed them. You don't have a lot of detail here about what exactly it is that this person's family have been sucked into, but you know enough to know that they're no longer available to this person, and this person feels immense levels of regret about that fact, essentially, about how that they can't connect to them anymore. And there's just this heartbreaking, because the song is essentially the story of them essentially in their death throes, trying in their final moments essentially to, it reminds me a lot, without spoiling anything at all, and this is not a spoiler, but it reminds me a lot of the final season of The Leftovers, which really digs into the theme a lot about this idea of like, how much do you want to be able to connect to or find closure about loss, and what will that do to you? And there's the final verse of this song where he's just kind of like, after this long journey, arrived at this building or this place essentially where the bodies of his family are when they plugged themselves into this machine.
That shit is fucked.
And he's basically he's basically willfully just destroying whatever is sustaining them in this place, because he can't bear to be unable to interact with them, or he can't bear the thought that they are there forever and he's not. And he's just like, he's pulling out the wires and he's smashing the glass, and he's like, and it ends in this horribly tragic line where it's like, it's not that he was trying to like, free them or anything like that, but just that he was trying to connect to them. And the last line of the song is, I'll just have to find another way to reach them. And it's just this like horrible moment of just like, nothing has come from this. You're just in the same place of grief that you haven't processed, that you were in originally. And it really gets me. And so, yeah, the record doesn't have a lot of those moments of pure pathos, but that means that when they happen, they feel like you're just being completely flattened on a runway by a 737 that's falling out of the sky.
I can't believe it took me this long to think about it. Listening to this album is exactly like reading Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Like such an identical experience.
I mean, thematically, The Hermit and Tip of the Arrow as well are both songs that very much inhabit that space. And though I would say the writing styles are quite different, the way in which Richard uses like this incredibly, just verbose and esoteric language, particularly on The Hermit, to like painstakingly give you there's like a whole verse in The Hermit that is just about Richard describing the way that light looks when it is like passing through a leaf with a hole in it, and like the refraction of like he just gets so minute in what he's depicting, and it's so powerful for ways that I cannot like just yeah. Anyway, at this point,
it's like watching a Terrence Malick movie, and you see there, like you're watching a montage, and you're just like, I didn't even know this was like possible in this like medium, but I'm just
vaporous shafts of a burgeoning sun skewer the forest floor onto a world fresh begun, all in the name of the harvest, i.e., our ever onrushing plasma. Shadows of leaves, mottled by the cleaves of caterpillars' ardent mandibles, form a basket weave of glowing mud. The bluebells in bud. Like you have, and these two little verses, which probably take him about a minute and a half to sing because of the style that he's using on this song.
Yeah.
And you're just you are. It's like what you got on Hinky, where it's like it's like gruelingly, crushingly slow, but you are there. You're like you're inside.
Very much like Methuselah.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, anyway, Jen, you haven't chimed in at this point. I assume this is your first exposure to Richard. So maybe you might have a slightly different take a little bit, or just at least a more coming at this with less expectations, maybe sort of take. But I'm curious to hear what you made of this colossal, experiment, essentially.
Yeah, this is my first Richard Dawson experience. And Jake, I'm kind of relieved that I let you go first, because I kind of hold the same opinion about the sequencing of the album, where I like The Hermit. Hermit is a really good, I'll never get sitting down and listening to this and sitting through The Hermit and just being kind of like taken by its grand scale and the sheer audacity that it takes to be that minute at that magnitude.
Yeah, great way of putting it. Great way of putting it.
But it's probably one of my least favorite songs on the album.
Yeah, I'm in a similar boat.
I appreciate this much more, and Ryley, you kind of alluded to this, and I had this in my mind before we started this discussion, as like short story collection of this post-apocalyptic setting that Richard has created, and from a meta-narrative perspective almost cast himself in as, a bard-ish character, telling all of these stories in this really particular way. My favorite song on the album is actually The Tip of an Arrow, which we talked about a little bit earlier, which, the McCarthy comparison, wow, how did I not see that already? But like I said, the meticulous nature of the narrative and the storytelling, and the things that Richard alludes to but doesn't go into that detail about are just as satisfying as the thing that he describes down to the atom. He alludes to balloons that come down at night, and the father and the daughter talking about how they make their arrows, and she says, oh, why don't we just get weapons or food from this thing over there? And the way Richard describes it makes it as a reader, as a listener, feel very mysterious, but the way that the speaker is describing it, completely understandable. It's a world that is inhabited and being told to an audience of people that understand it, and us as the audience who live in a different world are kind of forced to imagine what it's like to be in it and be hearing these things, because I frankly just like the idea that these are stories told by a person who lives in this world, and not just Dawson making up stories of this world. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we're forced to kind of bridge that gap between our world and the one Dawson has created through this character, almost the storyteller. And I think that really comes to life on the museum, which, the social media allegory is something that didn't even occur to me. I was much more into it as like a historian perspective, but the things he describes and how when you're collecting information about the past and putting it on display, all of it becomes equal in its importance, because it's only as important as the viewer, the person looking at it, wants any of it to be. There's been a lot of discussion in the past few years of like the psychological effect of social media and how it equalizes kind of everything you interact with in your brain, where
Yeah.
like stories of war next to the stories of the World Cup just kind of bleed together in the time that you spend in your day.
Well, it's like we lose context for everything. Like we exist in a contextless environment, not just in the sense that, you know, we don't always have all the information when we like read headlines or whatever, however you want to think about it, but like just in general, the way that everything bleeds together robs us of context, which means that we fundamentally lose understanding. And the more we absorb, the less we know, because we're not understanding causality anymore. We're just kind of seeing disconnected events. And what's profound about that, I think, and museum, which is very well positioned as the centerpiece middle song, that's nonetheless like 3/4 of the way into the album. What's profound about that is that it allows you a moment to realize essentially that this is the whole purpose of the album. So we are, you know, whether willingly or not, we exist in a world without context. And so it starts to become more understandable why Richard writes these songs the way that he does, particularly with something like The Hermit. It's almost exclusively about context. Like you spend 20, 30 minutes just having an environment described to you, just having a scene set, you know, before, and like maybe one or two things happen in the song and it's kind of an incomplete story. But the whole point is that Richard wants you to be able to understand the place in which these things are happening or these people are existing. And to him, that's more important than what happens. Because we're all so used to knowing, okay, this has happened, but we don't ever really get the fuller understanding, you know, of everything that surrounds an action or an event. You know what I mean? So the whole album is about context. That's the reason why it is the way that it is. That's the reason why it's so languorous, why it's so slow, why there's verse after verse after verse describing leaves and mud and, you know, weird electronic detritus that just kind of peppers these landscapes. Is that Richard wants you not to necessarily like take away, you know, meaningful conclusions about people or stories or whatever. He just wants you to, for, you know, an hour and 20 minutes, just think about the context in which everything exists in, and how much we overlook or we aren't exposed to, or we forget to really take in. You know, it's like one of those things, it's the cliche where it's like, you know, every so often you go outside, you touch grass. It's like the touch grass cliche, right? The truth behind that is, you know, the power behind what that is getting at is this idea that we don't appreciate, you know, the things that aren't immediately impacting us. We don't appreciate, you know, nature. We don't appreciate things that aren't right now relevant to what's happening to us right now. And the whole record feels like, if there's one thing to take away from it, it's to appreciate the things that don't even matter.
I don't want to get like too bogged down in details, just because this is a particularly morose detail, but phrasing it like that just kind of unlocked something in my brain. Is that well, I mean, listeners know people like Jen and myself live in the United States, and I won't go into too much detail about it or anything, but there's a shooting that happened here recently, because it's the US and there's one that happens every other weekend. And I found out about it through social media, and I think, like a lot of people, it was a difficult thing to process. And 2 days later, after I had been reading about it for so long, I was at the end of my shift at work, and I looked up to see that the TV was on, which it never was, but it was on the news channel, and it was talking about what had happened. And like 2 minutes of watching that shit, I was bawling. I was sitting there alone in the fucking break room, and I was like crying. And it never really put together, like it kind of lingered in my mind afterwards as to why that even happened. I was just like, why did that even, like, I don't, it's because I took a moment to stop and remember context, to remember all the things that, like, to not just absorb things as like a pure bit of data, as like a number or a word or a letter, to just sort of process it so that my mind would interpret it as a statistic or as a something. I mean, and I know it sounds kind of basic, but it's just like, you just stopping to smell the roses and whatnot, you lose your connection to your humanity. You lose your connection to the things that are so vital about human existence. So I really feel like I really want to listen to this album again now with this sort of added context to that, because I really feel like with that, just knowing that's sort of the grand vision here, I wonder if I'll actually appreciate this stuff more, because I really like that conceptual framework, for the record. Honestly, that's a really good way of putting it.
Jake, I think that experience that you just described is something that Richard essentially basically writes about in The Hermit, in this passage. Still ringing in my ears as I went creel in hand through the bog of names. Upon entering a blossom grove, I went into a total spasm as a storm of info broke abruptly across my retinas. I came around to an enhanced perception of every life form within a 10-yard radius. Each throbbed with its own aurora. Utterly awed, I'd inadvertently drawn to my mind's eye a lone ashy minor bee. As if to a plate under a microscope, I sobbed as I zoomed among individual hairs on its forelegs and face, and stared for a long time into the ommatidia. Performing a scan on a cache of false death caps, I found I could trace their history all the way back to manufacturer. So, like, obviously,
Jesus,
like, what you're describing is like a sudden acute awareness of like the human toll of tragedy, like this thing that happened, actual human beings, being a suddenly acutely aware of that. And this is contextually different, but it's the same idea. It's like sudden awareness of every little tiny detail on a bee or on a mushroom or on just the first thing that's in front of you, and just a sudden awareness of that bringing you to tears. And that's my, and that part of that song is, I've been thinking about it a lot ever since I heard it for the first time, because
I think a key part of this too is that Richard's not telling you to like feel bad. He's not like insisting that these details or that these things are like it's informing my experience in a particularly morbid way, but he's saying that these details are like the things that enrich your life and that make like experiences worth having. It's not like he's not coming across as being like, oh, you fucking put down your cell phones and go touch like he's not coming across as being that simplistic, or that like his writing is too nuanced for that.
Yeah. And he has like, and then the next part of the song is like, I think the part where he kind of like makes this point as explicitly as he ever will, when he describes in the final part of the story, this hermit essentially looking ahead and seeing what he thinks to be a robot sort of, in this brush and in this sort of swampy landscape. And then as he gets closer, realizing that it's actually a human being, it's a human's body essentially, and it's maybe a little on the nose if I analyze it like this, but it's like this idea of like something that seems at a distance, when you're distanced from it, to be artificial, to be just this, lifeless thing. And then the closer you get to it physically in this song, but of course, in the context of we're talking about, closer mentally, the more you're aware of the actual like humanity of it, and it's like in this story, he even gives it a grandiosity, because what this hermit thinks to be a robot, as he gets closer, he describes it as a gilt-clad knight of old, like submerged at the waist in unyielding concrete, flailing his arms to a windmill of gold. Like he gives him this real grandiosity, essentially. And then it gets even closer, and he pulls back the armor essentially, and then sees that beyond the grandiosity of that vision of this person suddenly that he's become aware of is something, you know, much more vulnerable and just broken and human. And so it's like like, you know, starting from a distance and getting closer and closer and closer, this detail in the environment gets more and more meaningful, and then ultimately more and more mundane. I can't even really describe it better than that, but there's just something about that sequence that just really just it hits on a thing in my brain. And then, you know, that's the point at which the song kind of just, you know, the story itself stops and you get into that gorgeous, you know, choral outro that lasts like 12 minutes or however long it lasts.
That moment's worth experiencing this whole album for alone. That's such a great moment.
Yeah. So anyway, fitting for us to have such tangents in a review of this album. But anyway, Jen, you were saying things you enjoy about this record.
I was talking about Museum 10 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Jams and Tea podcast, motherfuckers.
We've said everything we needed to say. The only thing I want to leave my portion of this review with is, like I said, this is my first time listening to Richard Dawson, and I'm just so, I guess, taken by his craft and his ability to put all these stories together in a way that, even if the stories don't always gel for me, I can tell that he has a deep passion and a deep level of thought for all of these characters and all of these instruments and all of these choices in, you know, the vocals and the mix, and all of it comes together in such a precise way that even if this is going to be completely beyond you as a listener, if this is just not a boat that you want to hop on, I think you owe it to yourself to see an artist who's so committed to portraying this universe so specifically, so meticulously, because it's a feat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that anyone who finds this in any way affecting or beguiling or engaging, I mean, it owes it themselves to experience the full trilogy and the full scope of what Richard's achieved, I think, and what he's really cemented with this album. It's really remarkable. And I would like to, I guess, wrap up my thoughts by talking about Horse and Rider, the last song here. And it's interesting. It's funny because, like, as this album goes on, I don't know whether this is intentional or not, but it's almost like with each song, it starts out obviously with the most isolating song, with The Hermit, like right there in the name. This is a song about a person who is alone and defined by their aloneness. Thicker Than Water, you know, a song about someone who is alone and just racked by that, desperate to try and get back to the people that they've lost. The Fool, you know, a kind of, you know, self-indulgent, misanthropic person who has maybe put themselves into an isolation by driving away essentially everyone else that they have. You know, Museum, a song that is like, Museum is, I think, the first song on the album where you get like a sense of more than one person in a space, because you've got this context of like the curator of the museum essentially showing you through. And then The Tip of the Arrow, you know, that's the second song on the record with like more than one active character in the story. And then Horse and Rider is another song about two characters. This time, you know, the horse and the rider, you know, the person and their companion, who is both their accessory to guide them through the landscape to navigate, and also their sole friend. And there's something so, and maybe it's just as well because I'm already in an emotional state from the ending of Tip of an Arrow, which is like one of the most heartbreaking descriptions of loss ever. I mean, the way in which the end of the song describes, you know, essentially the death of this this daughter essentially through the eyes of their parent, it's you almost don't pick up on what's happening, but like, draw back your bow and slow your lungs. When the cross glows, release your hungry arrow. I hear you whisper no. Your arrow falls limp in the snow. The monster retreats. You wipe the tears from my cheek. Like, that's just such a gut-wrenching ending to that story. Like, you're suspended in this final moment between these two, or with the additional context as well. Like, halfway through the song, you get the line, it's the first time a child of mine has grown past the age of 10, making me the younger one, which is all like, how that doesn't make sense, but also like, it kind of, Richard does this a lot on the album where he'll say something like that and you're like, that doesn't make sense. So therefore there must be some other like contextual piece of information that would explain why the parent is younger than their child, some nature of the way that reproduction happens in this future or whatever, but it's never elaborated on. And so it's just this weird wrinkle that suddenly you can go on a tangent in your head to try and like explain why that might be. It's beautiful writing. But anyway, the ending of the song with just this final moment between the two of them. And it's ambiguous whether she has actually died, but it seems that like that's the case. And it's gut-wrenching. And then Horse and Rider comes in and I'm already just racked up by that. And this is just, to me, an incredibly emotional song. It's simply just about, again, like The Hermit, it's just about moving through a landscape, except this time the person isn't alone. And the way he describes this connection, this friendship, this companionship between him and his horse, our breath mingles in the stable gloom as you attire me by a spoke of moon, bridle across my face and bit between my teeth. That's actually like, it's a powerful moment as well. It's just occurred to me, like, this is not only is this, it's one of the few moments where it's about a relationship where both parties are present in the story, but this is actually from the perspective of the horse, not the rider. So Richard is here embodying not even a human being anymore, but he's describing the affection and the respect and the love that this animal has for its care, essentially. And then later in the song, talking about how they, still at dream, we fly, and talking about leaving behind a rose horizon, and the horse describing the way his rider leans in on the saddle to embrace him, and the horse wondering if she knows that there's no way back to the world from which she was born, and that the only way out is forward and down. And it's just this amazing moment of just, shit, man. It really gets me. It's this amazing moment where we're taken into this perspective of this animal, and we're just like, and this animal who has this kind of love for its companion, for its rider, for its owner, but also this desire to understand them better in a way that it can't, because there's only so much that they can communicate with each other. And this moment of just like genuine concern that the horse has for its owner, and then going back to their ceaseless barreling, along weed-burst motorways, past the tangled silence of our emptied cities, over unseen churning seas we go, never-ending passage through the cold and dark. And you're just, and that final moment, of the last lyric there, you're just, it's a completely unforeseeable destination and future, and it's just this haunting ending. It's an album that's really just, it's inaccessible, it's demanding, it's grueling, it's all these things, but God, if there isn't just this beautiful beating heart that runs through all of it, and this just pure emotion that Richard carries for every detail of his stories, for all the creatures and the people and the things, everything has equal weight. And it's, it's not a perspective that many writers take anymore, really. Richard is a writer who gives you a greater appreciation for how much depth and beauty and meaning there is in everything. And yeah, and that's why you should listen to the Ruby chord, because I think sometimes we need a reminder of that. Okay, favorite tracks and ratings for this album. Jake, why don't you go first?
My three favorite tracks on here are going to be Museum, The Fool, and The Tip of an Arrow. Shout out to Horse and Rider for still being fantastic. My least favorite track is probably Thicker Than Water, but it's really not that much of a difference between this and everything else, so and I'll give the album a enthusiastic 7.5, an essential listen for this year for everybody, regardless of how you end up feeling about it.
Awesome. As for me, my three favorite tracks are The Tip of an Arrow, The Hermit, and The Fool. Which, as I kind of alluded to, The Fool I think is the most incredible achievement Richard's ever had musically yet on any of his records. So we've talked so much about songwriting and stuff, but the musicality here is quite, captivating and occasionally blindsiding, and that's definitely the truest moment. I simply don't have a least favorite song on this, and it gets an 8.5 from me.
My three favorite tracks are going to be, I'm going to say Thicker Than Water, Museum, and The Tip of an Arrow. And Ryley, I'm kind of in the same place as you. Calling any track on this my least favorite probably is a disservice. I'm going to give this a 7.5 and enthusiastic, but a bit of an asterisk in my recommendation.
Awesome, which gives us an average overall of 7.8 for Richard Dawson's The Ruby Chord. All right, let's move into our second review of the day, which is the new album from Brockhampton, The Family, and its accompanying parting gift, TM, as well. The Family is, well, you know what? I do enough context on this show. Jake, Brockhampton, I mean, we're all fans of Brockhampton on this show, pretty unequivocally. Even August came around on Saturation Trilogy eventually. But Jake, you are the beating heart of this podcast's affinity for Brockhampton. So why don't you tell us all we need to know about what this album is, why it exists, and essentially how we should begin discussing it?
Well, 2022, a year of many blessings and many curses, both in the wider sphere of the world and in music, because rarely ever do I think we get to talk about the new releases, at least wise. Rarely ever I think will we be afforded the chance to talk about our the top shelf of all of our favorite bands releasing new content in a year than we did this year. I mean, I had Porcupine Tree and the Mars Volta, literally my two favorite bands in the world, came back inexplicably this year and both dropped albums that we both thought were minimum very good, maximum great. And so, when you find out that your favorite bands are releasing some good stuff, you get pretty excited. And I think that Brockhampton they don't quite occupy that space for me, just because nothing quite could. But in terms of the upper echelon of my favorite bands, Brockhampton are up there. And I feel like all of my favorite bands that have released something this year have occupied a different type of release for each band. And that Porcupine Tree came back, and they came back with an album that reminded you why they were great. They came back and delivered material that's as strong as they ever have been. They didn't take a whole lot of risks. They didn't do a whole lot of things new, but they knew what they had to do to reassert themselves in the world of music, and they did it about as well as they possibly could have. The Mars Volta, on the other hand, came back and delivered a huge left hook. They came back and delivered an album that got incredibly mixed reception from people at large, but from us it was a breath of fresh air for them. It was a different kind of mode for them, and we really appreciated that about them. So regardless of how I feel about that album on like a holistic level, it was still a nice bit of content from that band that I'm glad that I have now. And those, certainly I have, you know, certain levels of appreciation for each of them. But these releases from Brockhampton occupy a different kind of release, in that this is the type of release you never want to review from a band. This doesn't signify a left turn. This isn't a reassertion of why this band were good. Even hell, framing both of these as albums is inherently dishonest from the get-go, because that's not what either of them are. And that has led them to be received the way that they have been, which is, to be frank, not well. And I think that I have complicated feelings about literally every aspect of all of this, unsurprisingly. But just to recap with everybody, we do have reviews for each and every Brockhampton release. I, in several, like 3 mini segments of reviews, reviewed the Saturation trilogy last year. We did record clubs on Ginger and Iridescence, 2 very long videos unpacking our history with those albums, and we reviewed Roadrunner when it came out. And I know I'm pretty much the only person who Roadrunner stuck with in the long run, but I love that album still. I think it's not my favorite from the band, but it is the high point of their creativity and synergy for me. Even if no one else feels that way, but nobody's reactions to the way this band has completed their arc make sense to me. But discussion for another day. So basically what happened is that Brockhampton, group of musicians from all over the place, but mainly from Texas and California, formed together and came out with a sort of EP mixtape called All American Trash, which wasn't particularly very good, but showed a lot of promise. Then they self-produced, holed up in a house in San Marcos, and made 3 records that ended up defining the late 2010s in terms of hip-hop. They absolutely exploded from pushes from, you know, indie blog people, Pitchfork, Anthony Fantano, that entire world of alternative music kind of blew them up. And then they signed for a record deal. And they had an album. They had drama with one of their past members who they ended up kicking out of the band. They scrapped the album that they had, and that's how we got Iridescence, which is, to this day, my favorite hip-hop album of all time, warts and all, and assuredly it does have warts. But go check out our review of that to get more on it. And so Iridescence is an album that shows a lot of frustration, and obviously that was a bit of a roadblock for them. And then pivoting after that, going with Ginger, was a moment of healing for them, but they were still kind of stuck in what initially fractured them topically. They're very much focused on, like, it felt like they kind of were thematically derailed a bit, so that they couldn't really focus on making those post-saturation albums that they were focused on making, and it became a little bit more internal, a little bit more introspective. And then after that, they had Roadrunner, which to me is kind of the fulfillment of Brockhampton as a concept, as an idea. It feels like this is their push forward by having lots of other artists included in features on there. Again, Danny Brown is one of the people that was on there. And this whole thing is this full circle moment of, you know, certain members of the band sort of completing a bit of a journey with some drama that they went through. But it really much felt like the band was sort of all on the same page, operating at a level where they just consistently kind of hit it out of the park over and over and over again, with an album that is as amazingly, like, fun as it is deeply emotional and deeply cathartic. And they still had to make 2 more albums for their record contract, and we haven't really known what's been going on in terms of the internal machinations of the band. It whispers, rumors, theories, forums, nothing definitive. But with the release of The Family, I think it's safe to say that Brockhampton had imploded long before we suspected that it actually did. And Roadrunner was a bit of a flash in the pan. It was a moment where they all came back together despite whatever was going on, and they managed to work through it, crank out an album. But from what it sounds like now, not only is this like, oh, their record contract is fulfilled, Brockhampton is never going to make an album again. Unless this is all some insane, deep meta level fucking marketing thing, which I highly doubt that it is. But
I mean, the only context,
the family,
like they're all young, so I could foresee a future like 10 years down the line, maybe where they reunite.
Maybe,
but it's definitely like the circumstances of this are so final that it's just hard to envision.
And at the end of the album, Kevin explicitly kind of mentions the fact that it's like, it seems like all of them have solo careers planned, or at least the vast majority of them do, whether that be behind the scenes, whether that being as like, you know, a main person. But regardless, this is not a Brockhampton album, like, to be blank. Like it's got the Brockhampton name on it. It's a Kevin Abstract solo album. In like, it has other producer credits and what have you, but this is a project of Kevin's own design. He is pretty much the only person who promoted it, which goes to show you how fraught in the band is these days, I guess. And the whole thing is, you know, it's 35 minutes. On the album itself, Kevin explicitly says the label needed 35 minutes of music. And this and TM, which that album is basically reworked scraps from the Roadrunner sessions. So both of these projects are rushed. Both of these projects are incomplete. They are jagged. They are fractured. And personally speaking, I'm not really interested in evaluating how good either of them are, because it's pointless, you know? Like, an album like The Family isn't an album. This is literally something that was made to fulfill a requirement. And yes, it was made cynically, but I think that there's something more to it than that. Whereas TM is like, yes, these are the last material from Brockhampton that's going to be released, but this is also like, this is a B-sides EP. It's not an album. It's not a statement. It's not all of the people coming together to make a record. This is like, as far as I'm concerned, these shouldn't even count as studio records from the band Brockhampton, but they have to be officially labeled as something. So now here we are, and we have the 35-minute long, whatever the fuck this is, from Kevin and whoever might have collaborated with him. And this album's difficult to evaluate just because, obviously, of what I've already said, but also because the project this is most comparable to, I would say, is Frank Ocean's Endless, and that is also an album that is full of fragmentary ideas, some fully developed songs, some not, that is made to get out of a record contract, but still nonetheless contains things that are of artistic merit within thereof. But this feels like it is more designed to be something, because Kevin is ostensibly aware of the fact that this is the send-off, this is the final Brockhampton album, and he has to do something. He has to make something out of it. And what results is the most depressing album I've listened to all year. Not in the sense that the lyrics are sad, or that it's just that this is you're listening to 35 minutes of a musician who assuming if you're listening to the final Brockhampton album, you have an affinity for Brockhampton and for Kevin to some degree. You're listening to a musician you like in denial for 35 minutes, talking about the fact that all of his friends aren't his friends anymore, that nobody talks to each other anymore, and he's trying to make this sound as big and as grand as possible on whatever budget or restrictions that he had, by having lots of bigger, shinier chipmunk soul moments that are on stuff like the first two tracks. And it is just so fucking disheartening to hear a band who was literally shaping the zeitgeist of 2017 and who has had lasting appeal that has gone through albums like Ginger and Roadrunner, and then this is the end where everything collapses and they are a shell of what they used to be, and it's just it's a mess.
It's been an interesting week with this album for me. I had a lot of thoughts on it, and none of them really make all that much sense, and that's okay, because neither does the record. Well, like, the thing is, the first thing, as you've already said, is that this literally only exists because of the RCA contract. Both of these literally only exist because of the RCA contract.
Yes.
And I don't even think that it's like, wishful thinking or like finding a loophole or whatever to say that this isn't a Brockhampton album. It's just,
no, I'm very confident in saying that.
it just isn't. Like, this is a Kevin Abstract solo album. I mean, there's no getting around that. Just because it has Brockhampton's name on it doesn't make it a Brockhampton album.
And the way that the final Velvet Underground album is the final Velvet Underground album.
And again, I don't say this because I'm like, oh, well, this doesn't count or whatever. I say it because let's accurately reflect, what we have in front of us. And that is the fact that, aside from Bearface, who executive produced this album and has a couple of production credits and a couple of weird, semi-fragmented, occasional vocal appearances that feel like they could just have been beamed in from anywhere, it is Kevin Abstract. It is just Kevin Abstract, and that's fine. I think that if the more I come to understand this as just being a Kevin Abstract album, the more palatable it is. But at the same time, it's fascinating as an artifact for the end of Brockhampton all the same. And I think that it is, it feels like a mean thing to say, but it almost feels like it's a fitting way of ending this story. I mean, the whole story of Brockhampton to me has been one of like these intense personalities that have just bounced off of each other constantly. And the energy has always been positive, more or less, most of the time. But it has just been this frenzy of just pure, intensely creative people just taking that energy and riding off of each other's highs and pushing each other to new places. And, as far back as Iridescence even, people were saying, I was saying, I'm sure Jake was probably thinking at the same time as well, like, it's so obvious this isn't going to last that long. Like, it just isn't built to last. And that's okay. Not everything is. And one of the things that's been important to me as someone who's always consistently enjoyed Brockhampton to accept is that built into the very nature of what this band is a clear and not distant end date. Because you cannot have this level, like this density of personalities with this density of like different perspectives, styles, all that sort of thing. It's fucking the basic laws of physics that can't sustain itself forever, right? That you're gonna have energies that are eventually going to clash, or connections, relationships, symbiotic, synergistic energy that's going to eventually start to, become a negative influence on each other creatively. That's just basic. It's just what, there was no way that was not going to happen. I think on some level we always knew that, and we just kind of hoped for the best for what we had. And I think to Brockhampton's credit, in terms of, their creative integrity, with Ginger and Roadrunner especially, they pulled together. I mean, Ginger, I guess they were still, more or less doing okay. But with Roadrunner, essentially, they pulled together, they really put everything into that album, and you can feel it. You can feel the effort in that record. And I mean, Kevin talks about it from his perspective on this album as well. He talks about, how much he had to pull from himself to put together.
Said it was a miracle.
Buzzcut. Yeah, exactly. And that, that feels like something that, it is a miracle that album exists, and that album is as good as it is. And I'm sad for Brockhampton that their ending has been as acrimonious as it has. There's definitely plenty of moments across this project where Kevin is essentially, he's very openly just sort of talking about specific clashes and feuds and things that You know, he admits in some points that he's partially responsible for igniting, but also that he feels a level of frustration about being blamed for. You know, he talks about feeling a level of responsibility for the upkeep of the band's image that just completely weighed him down. But also you get a sense as well of Kevin also putting a certain level of pressure on everyone else in the band. You know, the way that he would constantly, you know, tweet about like projects that were unfinished, or essentially trying to guilt his bandmates into releasing music. There's just this really ugly sense of an unhealthy relationship and an unhealthy dynamic that pervades the group more and more following their major label signing, and the sudden reality of expectation that's put on them. And so like all that stuff, it is not fun to listen to. It's actually upsetting to listen to, but also in a weird sense, the more I've listened to this week, the more it's also felt like a kind of sense of, I've been able to get a weird sense of closure from it. Like, I know now why this, you know, why this collapse essentially is happening. I maybe know more than I should, and maybe know more than the other members of Brockhampton would want me to know, but I at least have a stronger sense now of why things did need to end. Because up until this point, the image of Brockhampton has been so like colored and just in a lot of ways soiled by the toxicity of their fan base. And this is something that Kevin really does vent about on this album as well. You know, there are things that, you know, ever since what happened with Amir, and, you know, all this sort of stuff post that within the band, you know, Kevin's lingering connection to Amir was his best friend, you know, and the way in which that is difficult to ever reconcile or maintain, considering the acrimonious relationship between Amir and other members of the band, you know, all that sort of stuff. I maybe didn't need to hear more about that, but in a lot of ways, you know, it helps me to understand why Brockhampton, why this happened when it did. And in a lot of ways, you know, it feels like the ugliness of this, the brutality of these revelations, it's almost like it's a just desserts, essentially. And not that I've done anything wrong, or any of us have, but like, it's a just desserts for the Brockhampton fan base in a certain sense. Is that you've demanded all this of us, you've hounded us, you've persecuted us, you've made a spreadsheet of spurious allegations against us. You know, you've done all that sort of shit, and here's what you get. You know, here's, you know, you wanted the drama, you wanted the, like, you know, well, here it is. You know, here's the reality of how it's affected us.
I really want to touch on that for a moment, just because it's not on here a lot, but it definitely is. Like, there are moments where Kevin does directly address some of the things that, for example, some people said about him. For example, him addressing directly the fact that he said he does not fuck any of his fans. I have to say, if there's anything, the tone of this is obviously not, it's very dour. I have to say that I come away with this project with a begrudging respect for it more than anything else, because I find it to be like, just take away all the things aside, how you evaluate music and the fact that these are song fragments and not actual like developed songs. I walk away with this from a particularly strong emotional reaction, and I don't even fully understand that reaction. So my feelings and how they translate into my overall evaluation of this record, whether or not my feelings are positive or negative, it's messy and it's complicated, and I don't know. So there's my answer to that. Yeah. But I have to say, the one like unequivocal compliment I'll give here is that, like, I don't envy Kevin Abstract one iota. I don't envy him personally. I don't envy him because of the burden that's been placed on his shoulders. And I certainly like respect the willingness he has on this album to make himself look ugly, because he certainly does indulge in it, honestly, again, to the point where it does feel like there's some shit that you don't need to know that you find out on this album. But you really do feel like Kevin is like, well, if the ship is going down, then I might as well go down with it. And he talks about the various pressures that he puts on his friends and the thing, like, and just sort of the reasons some relationships might have fallen apart. And I get that. And I also like I was it never sat right with me, Brockhampton's fan base, at least a certain segment of them, and how they treated the band post Amir and how they reacted to all of that and the allegations, which weren't even real. Like all of that stuff, it made me, it reminded me of all of the terrible things about music and music discourse and music culture in the 2010s. And it feels really, again, poetically kind of fitting that that was something that really weighed this project, which came to define such a segment of the world of music for so long, that it also became to slightly be its undoing. And I understand his anger and his frustration here and his willingness to want to at least say something about it, because frankly, it would have been smarter not to, because that's just the way things are. But again, if I put myself in that position and I found out people were saying spurious things about me or my friends, yeah, I'd be pretty fucking pissed about it. I would want to mouth off. I would want to say shit. And taking this opportunity to do so, I don't necessarily begrudge him. And it helps that that's not all this is. It is balanced with a heavy sort of reminiscence on the earlier days of like a nascent Brockhampton, of pondering what things were like before then, and dreams and nostalgia and success. And it's not something that Kevin goes into with great detail. It's just shards of memories and songs and verses that you get a tiny little glimpse at. But that feels appropriate, because if we got anything that attempted to be more substantial than this, that's a lie. That's a lie, because it's only Kevin. This is only his viewpoint that he can speak from. If he tried to make this a legitimate, fully fleshed out record where he did a bunch of songs that were all about how sad he was that the band like disbanded and how sad he is about all of his friends, it's just like, that's so heavily weighed in his favor. And I feel like Kevin knows that. So the best way to approach this is by kind of just throwing it all together. And I'm not saying that makes it a good album. I'm not saying that it makes it an album. I'm not saying that it makes it good. I'm just saying that it's 35 minutes of listening to somebody grieve their own memories, and it makes me feel like dog shit.
Well, and here's where it gets a bit even more complicated for me, because like that first couple times I listened to it, that was basically my perspective as well, where I was like, you know, this was obviously like a cathartic venting for Kevin. But the more I sit with this, the more that starts to bug me, because it's that, but it's also, you know, is it Kevin's right to do any of this? And the more like
probably not.
The more that I like listen to this, the more I get a really just a shitty feeling from what he's doing on here. And I'm not like saying like he's doing this in a malicious way. He's venting in the way that he needs to do, and everyone has to be able to do that. But I definitely, the more I sit with this, I start to feel for the other members of Brockhampton who, you know, understandably wanted nothing to do with this, and presumably had no say in the things that Kevin said about them. And so that's the other thing, that while I get that this had to be released to fulfill a contract, it's just unsavory that this personal venting session for Kevin, which often involves, is a very one-sided and is just him depicting his side of all that shit that happened within the band, nevertheless gets the label of Brockhampton as though it somehow represents all of them. And I'm not saying I blame Kevin, or I'm not saying I'm, you know, in any way angry at him or whatever. It's just this really unsavory feeling I get from all of it, where it's like, yes, everyone has the right to vent and grieve and all those sorts of things, but Kevin ultimately, it just feels wrong.
I've been anticipating and also dreading this discussion, because I've been keeping up with the kind of discussion of this album on two sides, one very purposefully and one kind of accidentally, one of which was on Rate Your Music and the other of which was on TikTok. And the TikTok discussion of this album has skewed positive, probably because the algorithm has pushed me toward positive opinions the second I saw one. And the
Probably.
opinion on Rate Your Music have skewed mixed to negative. But
Yeah.
first, as the only person here who has not spent 10 plus hours on record talking about this band, I owe it to myself and you all to leave a little bit of myself on the table here.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
My history with this here boy band goes back to early months of quarantine. I discovered Ginger in March or April of 2020 because I really started getting into Fantano. I was watching a bunch of his like more recent positive reviews. Watched his review of Ginger, sought that out, and my emotional experience with Ginger was in a time when I was the most alone physically I've been in my entire life, surrounding myself with the stories of these boys and the tumultuous step that the band was in that up until now I was unfamiliar with. So I'm like coming in at the dark middle chapter and experiencing all of that. And
The lore was important from day one.
yeah, the lore was important to me from the day I discovered this band. I was not around when it was only saturation. And that being said, I'm going to paraphrase something that August said in our Evangelion video. The most frustrating thing about this album is Kevin's insistence that he is Brockhampton.
Yeah.
And I mean this because, again, Ginger being my first album, for me, this band does not exist without Kevin. That is true. That is fair to say. This band does not exist with Kevin and his story about his sexuality and his relationship with his mother that comes up album after album after album and has been genuinely compelling to see unfold over time as he references it across these records. But you also don't have Brockhampton without Amir's departure, Matt's family, Joba's inner turmoil and the loss of his father, as we saw on Roadrunner, and Dom as a performer in the dark middle chapter on Ginger, where he was reckoning with his own place in the band on Dearly Departed. You don't have Brockhampton without any of these things. And so the insistence, and I don't even think this applies only to the family, I think it applies to TM too. The insistence that Kevin speaks for Brockhampton is borderline ahistorical. The family feels like half of the track list is good songs that were missing a verse, which is funny because he has a line about not being sorry that he cut out your verse. And the other half feels like stuff that probably would have been interludes on Iridescence that would have worked better if they had full songs around them. And I'm just thinking of how to tackle this monster of an album. But here's the thing. This is my least favorite kind of art. This is the kind of art that I despise
yeah,
the most,
you and me both.
which is the forward facing spitefulness. And it reminds me of two things in specific. And I've just sat here and made this connection in my mind. It reminds me of the Reputation Taylor Swift album and the movie Malcolm and Marie. Both of which.
God. I hate that I know what you mean.
Can I just say, just for the sake of fun, those are two very maligned works of art that I low-key kind of like now. That means nothing. I just wanted to say that.
This is my least favorite kind of art. Like I said, this forward-facing spite, the idea of making art as an act of angering the people who are going to listen to it, or angering a specific type of person that's going to be listening. With Taylor, that's a whole can of worms I don't feel like discussing, or I'll be here all day. With Malcolm and Marie, Sam Levinson is going after the critics and whatever. With this, it feels like Kevin is making this album to get at
Brockhampton
the
Reddit.
people who, yeah, making an album to go at the people who made this band insufferable to talk about online in the first place, which is just
Making my skin crawl.
not worth investing in.
The real tragedy of it, though, is that like it is that those people and the people who made Brockhampton what they are basically the same people. So it is like it's a weird like bundle of like paradoxical contradictions.
And you know, I don't necessarily like if I have any like criticisms of this experience, it's certainly that, in that I think the only thing I even kind of disagree on is the fact that I don't really think Kevin insists that he's Brockhampton. I think he really presents a front that's really more anything of like, I'm being forced to do this. I'm in clown makeup and I'm here for your amusement. I never got the vibe that he was trying to speak for anyone other to himself. And I think that's its own kind of problem that presents its own fair share of issues. But I think that if anything, it's frustrating to try and reckon with this, because on the one hand, I don't blame him for wanting to sort of speak out about that and like for that frustrating him, because I, for years, have been frustrated by the fact that you can't talk about Brockhampton without somebody being like, oh, Brockhampton are lame. And it's just like, sure, man, okay, you've done nothing to progress this discussion whatsoever. I love hearing every other weekend on my fucking Twitter timeline about like, oh, what were we all thinking in 2017 listening to Brockhampton? I don't care. I don't give a shit. You are useless when you say things like this. But at the same time, Kevin had complete creative freedom here to do whatever the fuck he wanted. And I get it. He had his limitations. He had to do this all by himself. Cool, whatever. But at the same time, you could do whatever you wanted here. And you chose to make it something that is very embittered and very, very nasty.
And that's where I get off, exactly, is because there's this, I completely agree. It's this like thing where it's like, I do not buy at all into the idea of like, oh, well, Kevin did this because he had to. No, he didn't. This could have been anything. Metal Machine music. You know, do whatever you can do to get out of your label
Kevin
contract.
had to make an album, but he didn't have to make an album about this specifically. He could have made this album about anything.
I'm not saying this has to be like a love letter to the fans. I'm not saying Brockhampton
no, I'm not either.
Take a final bow, but you don't have to be the drummer of you don't have to be the drummer of Creedence Clearwater Revival writing songs about how John Fogerty is a dick.
Oh God. Oh man.
Which is what this really reminds me of.
This album and Mardi Gras really do kind of have a spiritual kinship together. I didn't even think about that, but it really does sort of, it's like we're getting the complete opposite. To me, this is like the opposite of that, but with like the same effect, and that you get that they have that one song on Mardi Gras about how the ship captain sucks, and this is just an album from the perspective of the ship captain. And like I get that it's trying to be more than that, that it's trying to be sort of a complicated reckoning of like, and a sort of warm reminiscence of Brockhampton, but it's like in trying to do all of these things, it doesn't really fully accomplish being any one of the things that it sets out to do.
Every Brockhampton album has a purpose for the band.
Yes.
Saturation is about getting it out there, and then Iridescence is about like making the album as an act of keeping the band together, and then Ginger is about reckoning with having to do what you did on Iridescence by actually like slowing down and thinking about things, and then Roadrunner is also kind of like reckoning with where you've been by making an album about it and getting the statement out there. And the family, that's all that Kevin is doing. He's making an album about having to make the album, but TM is just nothing. There's no
it's not
purpose
even
behind any of it. It's just a bunch of like hooks and images that don't mean anything. And after 4 albums that are so concretely connected to the history of the band, that's worthless.
If nothing else, we can get one unequivocally positive thing from this, and that's I think we can reasonably expect, when they're ready, of course, the members of Brockhampton are probably still going to make music. It seems like they both had, plenty of them had solo careers before Brockhampton. I'm sure that they're going to have solo careers afterwards. I hope the people behind the boards get as much love and due diligence as the people, you know, who are the face of the band. But here's the thing. This is a really unfortunate record to have to listen to have to review, and to have to think about, and all of that stuff. But it is also the best thing that both of these things accomplish is that they effectively kind of write themselves out of their own existence. They kind of exist to just sort of push themselves aside. They don't have any illusions about what they are, which is, you know, they're very messy, but they still don't presume to be anything else. And this is not the ideal way you want a band to end. Ideally, you know, we as music listeners, when we're fans of bands, I feel like there's sort of an unrealistic expectation of like, oh, this band is just going to exist for as long as I listen to music. And, you know, they'll end when one of the members dies in like 20 years, even though members of plenty of our favorite bands probably won't even live to see 20 years, but whatever, that's sad. But we can't reasonably expect that to always be the case. We can't expect any band really to always go out on their own terms. I mean, like, if you could, like, trying to think of bands that did not end due to circumstances that were unforeseen is a fucking Sisyphean task, because not many of them did. And when you're able to close out a career of making art, that's cool. And it's cool that we can maybe look forward to this. But, like, let's just say that this is the last thing we ever get from any of the members of Brockhampton, that they never go on to do anything ever again, as unlikely as that seems right now. I still love this band so much. Like, and that doesn't extend to this album, that doesn't extend to TM, because they're not canon. They're not real for me. And that's not just because I don't want them, their streak to be ruined or whatever. It's because they're not. It's just they're not full collaborations from the band, and I don't accept them as such. But I have waded through discourse, drama within the band, drama within the fan base for years and years and years, and it has been so tiring. It has been so exhausting. And I know that some people are probably out there thinking like, oh yeah, poor you, critically acclaimed online band, had a couple of dissenters and you had to listen to people bitch about them, blah blah blah. Go on Twitter, shut the fuck up. Actually, don't go on Twitter. Elon Musk owns it now. It's terrible. But the point I'm trying to get at here is that this band has been so crucial to me discovering more music and more about my music taste. And like, they weren't a band that I loved from like the get-go, because I only got on once Saturation 3 was released, but they were a window into a world of music I hadn't explored yet. All of the music that I was listening to in 2017 was music that had been passed on to me through Morgan. I had made very few of my own musical discoveries. So when I discovered Brockhampton and none of my immediate friends were into them, it was like finding gold. And it was kind of isolating at first to be the only person that listened to a particular band, but it meant that they got to be special for me. Saturation is a trilogy of records that I'm forever going to associate with my teenage years and summer and the idea of childhood and nostalgia, and nothing will ever take that away from me. And Iridescence is a complicated, messy album full of drama, but nothing in it is miring down the incredible words that are being delivered by everybody on there. Everyone is at their lyrical peak there, and they're talking about really personal things and insecurities that I deeply identified with, and feelings that I understood even if I wasn't some now famous boy band member. And Ginger was, again, we talked about that album. That was essential soundtrack to one of the best weekends of my entire life, and became a sound that I forever am going to associate with a warm, wonderful experience. And Roadrunner was the first album I got to enjoy with all of my friends. I remember when the album leaked and Ryley and Morgan and I all listened to that, we were losing our fucking minds on Twitter. Every single track, every single bar, every single verse, we were just like, oh shit. And it was just so much fucking fun. I don't remember the last last time I listened to an album communally with people that got us that hyped and that excited, and it was so nice to feel such an uncomplicated love for a record after feeling like we were going to be mired in their drama forever. But you know, with all the shit that's happened with Brockhampton, with the dissolution of the group, with the drama online, with people not thinking they're cool anymore, you guys made some of my favorite hip hop albums of all time, and nothing has changed that. And I listened to your entire discography this week, and nothing has changed. Your verses are still really poignant and emotional, and they're, you know, the beats are forward thinking and interesting and cool and unlike anything else out there. And all of you have such distinct, you know, characters and personalities and stories and craftsmanship into your work, and nothing can ever take that away from you. So regardless of whatever mess this is now, the legacy of Brockhampton should be the incredible highs that you all had before all of this shit went down. And I am going to forever be thankful because of that. So, you know, highly unlikely any of you are going to watch this because, you know, you're famous musicians and this is a fucking podcast in the ass crack of the universe. But I am deeply thankful to everyone who contributed to this music because it is an essential component of who I am at this point. So thank you for it. And nothing, not even a messy ass album like this, can tarnish that. So
beautifully said. I'll say, just to, on a less like emotional note, just as a music nerd, you know, one of my favorite things I discovered earlier this year, and I know you've checked it out too, Jake, is the great podcast that Stephen Hyden did with Jordan Rontag of Rolling Stone called Rivals. And it's a great podcast because they talk about, you know, disputes between bands, musicians across the history of popular music. And it's a really fun podcast, and the way they tell each story.
I've heard every episode.
Yeah, the way they tell each story is just really, really engaging. And then they have a great sort of, you know, levity to the way that they engage in those stories, even when they are heavy. And so to me, I feel like I've learned a lot about like rivalries and about like the intense, frictious nature of bands and collectives of artists. You know, it's just a definitional aspect of being in a band. Essentially, there's always some degree of friction, and your longevity is a product of, you know, the size of that friction multiplied by the time spent, you know, in each other's presence, essentially. And so for me to take a kind of more detached step back from my own feelings about the band, this is just kind of like fascinating little like portrait of intra-band sort of disputes and the ending of bands in the modern era. Essentially, we've had lots of like acrimonious breakups and all sorts of stories that have happened throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s of great bands or of notable bands that have kind of like flamed out, that have just kind of fallen to bits or whatever. And the story of Brockhampton's ending is, you know, upsetting and disheartening as it is when you're really immersed in them as a story, is like a fascinating insight into the, you know, 2020s equivalent, or like the current 21st century equivalent. Like you were the Brockhampton story is such a like, it's such an insightful and powerful like portrait of how the archetype of the band and the archetype of the sort of typical narrative of the band, the ascendance and the fall from grace and the, you know, collapse entirely, how that now plays out in the current sort of like hyper online era, essentially. And I don't mean to trivialize, but I think that that if you were to take a step back from your own connection to all of this, that's fascinating, culturally, socially, anthropologically. And it gives us a nice insight into how things have changed for the way that music and bands and collectives and artists operate in this hyper online era. You know, Brockhampton's inception came from the internet, essentially. It's a nice insight into how the internet defines art now, and how the internet recontextualizes this classic story, essentially, of great artists that come together and make great art. And then inevitably, that story has to end because of the inherent frictions with that many personalities. We've seen it throughout rock history. And so it's interesting. The story of Brockhampton is instructive, and it's meaningful, and it's fascinating. And I hope for the best for everyone involved. I mean, we can only be grateful that this could have ended, as far as band ending stories go, there's plenty worse than this. Everyone's still breathing, everyone's still making music, everyone's still, living their lives. And, we all hope for the best for all of them. And we all want to see what happens in the future. And the story of Brockhampton is instructive. It's fascinating. It doesn't diminish any of their art at all, but it just allows us to see how the current world and the current landscape of how we consume art, how art is created, how art is propagated, the effect that has on the people, and how that whole narrative and how that whole relationship plays out now. And we may get many, many more stories like Brockhampton's in the future to come. And we can only just appreciate what we have while we have it, and take the lessons away that we can take, and enjoy the art and enjoy the stories and enjoy the people. And yeah, anyway, all that is to say, R.I.P. Brockhampton, you were real. All right, well, the family. favorite tracks and ratings then, I suppose. We'll go reverse order this time. Jen?
Favorite tracks, I'm going to say Big Pussy and The Family. Least favorite is Basement. This is going to get a 3 out of 10.
All right, for me, I'll say, it's funny, I never really got to actually talk about any of this, but it's fine. There is a few songs on here I actually really like. I think Take It Back is great. The opening track here, I think it sounds fantastic. Beat's awesome. Sample's great. There's some really good sampling on some of these songs in the early stretch. I also really like All That and Big Pussy. Sadly, the album doesn't really ever animate me again beyond that, although the closing track, I guess, sounds pretty good and has a bit more fulsomeness to it. But the first 5 songs, I'd say, are actually generally across the board pretty good, if obviously incomplete. So yeah, cred where due for those. My least favorite is Southside, and I'm going to give the album a 5.
For the first and probably only time in our tenure during this podcast, I abstain. I can't rate these.
Respect. No, that's fair. All right. Well, then, between Jen and myself, actually, I should add Morgan's rating in as well. Morgan gave this a 5. So between myself, Jen, and Morgan, Brockhampton's The Family gets an average of 4.3. Let us know at home what you think of any of the music we have discussed today. The new Richard Dawson record, either of the new Brockhampton projects, any of the music we've talked about in general. There's quite a lot going on with the stuff we've talked about today. It's definitely a longer episode. So let us know what you think. We really want to hear your takes in the comments below as well. Let us know what Brockhampton meant to you, if they've meant half as much to you as they have to us, especially. We want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Both those things help us out an awful lot. Plus, if you want to go above and beyond and support us directly for just $1 a month, you can hit the join button and you can become a member of the Jams Tea family. Get your name in the title crawl of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us something to listen to and talk about on the show, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Airbnb, belong anywhere.